just turned it on. Hold on. I'm setting.
His live view. As far as I can tell, it's plugged in where it should, but mine just says. Let's
I have a longer cord if you need one.
here it says try and plug in yours, see if it.
So she said we could try it on phone.
You can try different lighting altogether.
And my workstation, only like 12 or 13.
I mean, it should work. Because I have like a cord that's plugged in.
I have like three.
Yeah.
I have like
Up there. Should be that easy.
It's only two.
Okay, could I call you back? Okay, bye.
This is where your smaller hands would be helpful. To get his cord in there.
Okay, cool. And I have a battery too, I can.
So I need to gain medium and actually made it lower ISO, and then when I go to high, it's like makes it like 5,000. So does the game just changes the ISO, right? Well, why can't I just change it manually at that point then? I just need to get it to a good exposure quickly, so. Okay, but it's too dark with 800.
Yeah,
So
that's
it's-
what
It does. Well, it did. It like it said the ISO was 800, then I went to medium gain, and then it changed the ISO like in the display. So I assume it's actually changed it. Well, I don't mind having to switch.
You're going live?
I don't.
Yours is
I think it's fine. Okay, I just bumped it up to 1250. And it's looking better. It looks good from what I can see.
it up and see it.
We're gonna use his.
Okay, cool. Yep,
All right, thank you.
okay, we got it.
You have a way to plug in power?
Yes.
Yeah, I would plug in.
Where's the best place for me to put this?
Must be some kind of difference setting on this itself. This quarter, wants to be a direct connection.
When I interrupt when we're setting up, so I just have to remind everyone. Original attachments for yours.
Right.
And just like the video and the audio that you just decided to previous days. Yeah. Still transmitting. Because
Right.
you can I think you don't have to turn it up, but just block the meeting audio while the judge is on.
Right. Okay.
Rise, people forward.
Good morning. We're on the record. The record will show the presence of all counsel and defendant. It's 8:30, the jury's ready, but I was told that counsel, the defense counsel, wanted to raise a preliminary matter before the jury. Is that correct?
Yes, Judge. We just wanted to make a quick record. We had some discussions with the state yesterday regarding how to proceed with the witnesses since we're taking them out of order today. And we communicated to the state, and the state avowed to us essentially don't be able to lay foundation for the things that the experts they are calling today will rely on. We are also taking a look at Rule 703, which states that the expert may base an opinion on information that the expert has been made aware of or has personally observed himself. So we don't think that there's going to be a problem with this. We're accepting the state's avowal that they'll be able to lay the foundation, and the state has agreed to stipulate that if for whatever reason in the future the state is not able to lay that foundation, then we reserve our right to object based on foundation. And we're doing that also for the court's efficiency, but also as part of the trial strategy, so we don't have witnesses come on the stand for 5 minutes, come off the stand, and then get recalled later, because that might be disruptive to the jury. So we just wanted to make a record. That's how we have communicated with the state.
Thank you.
That's correct, Your Honor. We appreciate you guys working with us on the schedule and to get more efficient for today.
All right, and let me just make sure I'm clear. First of all, I'm grateful that we're speaking to each other professionally like this and trying to resolve issues to make everything proceed more efficiently and expeditiously. But does that mean that there's a stipulation to the foundation? It doesn't mean that they don't have to call these witnesses, right? It just means that they're not going to.
Correct.
It does not mean. Let's see this.
We're
It
deferring
mean-
our objection on foundation until such time as I suppose they fail to lay it later with the proper witness.
So, okay, so for right now, the agreement is that the state doesn't need to call these 5-minute foundational witnesses to lay the foundation for the expert testimony that's anticipated today, but they will in the future at some point. And then if they're not able to, then that remedy would be available.
Yes.
Is that right?
That's correct, Your Honor. So our experts are going to be talking about photos, about scenes that we don't lay the foundation for, but we will later subsequent to the test.
All right, and does that mean, I assume this witness has some demonstrative exhibits?
I'm sorry.
Does this witness have any exhibits that he's going to introduce?
Please guys report. Yes, we can refer to the report and then maybe introduce or not introduce. We don't we see how the
Okay.
testimony goes. And there's one other small little issue. There was a preclusion of the other ammo in this case, but the witness, the expert, used other ammo recovered at the scene to test fire the gun, which is similar to the ammo in the case. And so we just want the court to be aware he's referring to other ammo used, and that's the other ammo. So
Thank you, appreciate you bringing that up. All right, great, that's really good news, I appreciate it. Very well, there's nothing further, then we can bring in the jury. We have the witness here.
witnesses in the background or outside.
We can bring the witness in. Oh, all right, we're taking it, well, hold on a second. Oh, so we're taking this witness now. And what about, you were still cross-examining?
Yes, we were cross-examining Castaneda, and we're gonna come back to him.
Okay, all right, thank you. Sir, just wait right there. Sorry, I thought you were somebody. Yeah. And we'll get the jury in, and we'll bring you forward and have you sworn. But he can wait right there, you're fine.
You could explain a little bit of this to the jury, I assume, Judge.
What do you want me to do?
Yeah,
Oh,
we're out of order.
yes,
Okay, thank
all
you.
right, okay, thank you. Thanks for bringing that up. All right, we'll just wait for the jury to come in, and then we'll bring you forward and have you sworn.
Is your child in fifth grade and learning to write about money?
Please rise, people forward.
Everyone, please be seated. The record will show the presence of all jurors, counsel, and the defendant. All right, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Let me just talk to you for a second before we get started. Today, this gentleman here who's standing over here is going to be our first witness for today. I don't know anything about him or who he is. All I know is that he's come here from out of town, flew in last night. And so we're going to try and get this gentleman on. He's a witness for the state. He's going to take the stand now and provide his testimony. Gentleman was on the stand before. That was Deputy Castaneda, is that right? And so in the interest of trying to make things move as efficiently as possible, we're going to take this witness out of order. Usually we finish with that witness that's on the stand. Some other witnesses will testify, and we'll get to this gentleman in turn, but he's from out of town. We're going to take him out of turn. He's going to take the stand now. He's subject to examination by both parties. And then we'll bring back Officer Castaneda so that we can finish his cross-examination. There are some other witnesses that provide foundational testimony for what this witness is going to testify to, but the parties have worked that out with the court. And those witnesses will still testify. But I want to make sure we get this gentleman on and off today, finish with Officer Castaneda, and that will allow us then to take some shorter witnesses. And the goal really is to try to get us all out of here a little early today. So that's why we're doing what we're doing. All right. So thank you for your understanding. Any questions about that? Very well. All right, we're ready to proceed. Sir, if you would come forward now and be sworn by the clerk.
Do you solemnly swear that the testimony you're about to give in the matter before the court will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? So help you God.
Thank you, sir. If you come over here to the witness stand, let's see.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Rick, Mr. Wine, can you state your name for the record and spell your last name?
Yes, my name is Richard T. Wyant, W-Y-A-N-T. Go by Rick.
May I call you Rick?
You can.
Rick, where are you from?
I'm from Seattle, Washington.
You flew in last night.
I did.
Let's talk about who you are. So walk the jury through a little bit about who you are, where your education is.
I'm a forensic scientist in the area of firearm and tool mark examination and shooting incident reconstruction. I obtained my bachelor's degree in 1993 from Colorado State University and my master's in 1994 from Colorado State University in forensic anatomy. My bachelor's was in microbiology. And in 1995, I was hired by the Texas Department of Public Safety, Texas Ranger Crime Lab, to be trained as a criminalist in the area of firearm tool mark examination. During those 3 years I was there, I was trained to do casework and also crime scene investigation. In 1998, I was hired by the Washington State Patrol Crime Laboratory in the Seattle area, and I've been there ever since. In 2008, I was promoted to supervisor, and in 2015, I started my own consulting firm doing the same type of work, shooting incident reconstruction, ballistic comparisons, less lethal weapon examinations, and that's the role that I am in today.
How many years have you been doing this kind of work as a forensic scientist?
I hate to say it out loud, but it's 28 years I'm doing this type of work, and I'm also a member of several associations, published some papers, and presented at professional organizations.
Let's walk through some of those. You've worked at accredited state labs, correct?
I still do.
Still do. What's an accredited state lab? What does that mean?
Well, accreditation is a governing body that oversees crime laboratories to ensure they're following proper protocols and procedures that are commonly used for forensic work. And part of that is chain of custody, analysis protocols, how we report, how we testify. And as part of that accreditation, we're inspected every 5 years. They go through our case files to make sure that we're taking proficiency tests, that we haven't gotten in trouble or said anything wrong on the stand, and then we're deemed to be accredited. And so my laboratory that I've worked at has been accredited ever since I started there.
And in your 28 years, you obviously examined firearms.
I have
How many would you say?
thousands. And in addition to my examination, I also teach at the ATF Academy, I call it Background Firearms Academy in Maryland, where I train new firearms examiners. That's what I consider myself as a firearms examiner. I've been doing that since 2005. So in terms of handling firearms, during that course, I handled probably 50 during that week, in addition to all the firearms that I've examined during casework.
I'll come back to that. Let's talk about the other stuff you teach about. Any other teaching or any other training you provide to other agencies?
Yes, as part of my day job, I of course teach all of our law enforcement agencies in Washington, but I also travel and teach attorneys and law enforcement. I've taught regularly at the National SWAT Conference in TOA, National Tactical Officers Association, where I train SWAT officers in less lethal weapons, like bean bags, things like that. So I've done quite a bit of training in my career.
It means a lot of travel for you.
It is.
Let's go back. So you examined, I think your words were 1,000 or thousands of firearms.
Between casework and training others, yes.
We're talking about handguns.
Handguns, revolvers, rifles, semi-automatic rifles, muzzle loaders, and then less lethal launchers like 40 millimeter. Anything that can launch a projectile, I've probably looked at in my career.
Includes AR style weapons,
Yes,
AK style weapons.
yes,
And you've also examined crime scenes.
I have.
What do you do when you come to a crime scene? What's your goal?
My goal is to establish a series of events based on the evidence that I looked at, the objective collected evidence, to establish possible scenarios related to a shooting incident. There's a lot of methods and ways we do that. One is the physical examination of the evidence. It's also documentation of the crime scene. And most recently, within the past 5 years or so, 3D laser scanning has been introduced to the crime scene realm. So I'm versed in that, and I've done probably 14 or 15 cases where I've utilized that technology to reconstruct a crime scene.
And I won't come back, but you also had reviewed a 3D scan in this case, right?
I did.
And you also do, I think you mentioned shooting scene reconstruction.
Yes.
What does that mean?
Well, like I just stated, it'd be taking the evidence that's collected from the scene, photographs, occasionally witness statements, but typically I like to use the objective evidence that's collected. And so, for example, say I have a vehicle that has bullet holes in it. You can place trajectory rods into those holes, map out a possible bullet path, and then you can scan that car with a 3D laser scanner and then be able to determine possibly the origin of the shooter relative to the victim at the time that the shots occurred.
So you're shooting scene reconstruction, did you apply that skill set in this case?
Yes,
And how many shooting scene reconstructions do you think you've done in your 28 years?
well, every case that I analyze has an aspect of shooting reconstruction. So say I just get a bullet submitted to me and a firearm, but that bullet might have some defects or some characteristics on it that might lead to tell me where it came from or what it struck first. So that's technically considered a reconstruction, but the full reconstruction where I'm taking all the scene evidence, and I've probably done a couple of dozen for my career, not including what I did in Texas.
And you also work for, I mean, you taught and trained for manufacturers of weapons, right?
Yes.
Like, give us some examples.
Most of the training I do for manufacturers would be for less lethal applications, meaning a projectile that is intended to hurt you and not kill you. I've helped develop a couple of those types of projectiles.
You also teach yearly at the ATF Firearms Academy,
I do.
and ATF stands for,
Alcohol, tobacco, and firearms. It's the federal regulatory agency for firearms. And they also host an academy that trains people to do what I do every year. And they bring in students from any local agency in the country, and they sponsor this academy. And I've been training at that academy for a week long. It's called Preliminary Examination of Firearms. It's essentially cycle of fire. So from the time you take that cartridge out of the ammunition box until the bullet is downrange and the cartridge case is on the ground, what has happened to it? So the cycle of fire of that cartridge. And that's what I teach at ATF.
you also teach things like operation of a weapon.
Yes, the cycle of fire certainly is encompassed by the operation of the firearm, the types of firearms that are out there that we might see as forensic scientists.
You also talk about the capabilities of specific firearms. What I mean by capabilities, distance, how lethal they are, and so forth, right?
We have in-depth training on different types of projectiles and their behavior in flight and when they impact targets.
Do you like shoot from a distance and measure and do all that stuff? How do you do that?
We shoot intervening objects. We ricochet bullets off of objects, capture them in ballistic gelatin. We track bullets on Doppler radar to map incremental velocity, how fast is it slowing down as it travels downrange. I've done that for a couple of long distance shooting cases that I've had. The jury has a question. Oh, you're raising your hand, sorry.
Scratching my nose, sorry.
Okay.
My apologies.
All right, Rick, this is probably the most obvious question. You don't work for the Santa Cruz County Attorney's Office, do you?
I do not, and I'm not functioning as role as Washington State Patrol here either. This is my own private consulting firm that I'm working under today.
You were requested to assist in the investigation in this case?
Yes,
Do you know what this case is about?
yes.
What was it about?
It was a shooting incident that occurred and where one person was shot and killed.
And what were you called to do? What were you asked to do in this case?
I was called to look at the crime scene and scan evidence and the ballistic evidence to determine if I could determine possible shooter locations and possible trajectory path of the bullet.
And before we get into that, what was the weapon that you reviewed, that you looked at?
I looked at an AK-47 pattern rifle. It was a semi-automatic version of the Russian AK-47, one of the most popular rifles in the world.
You also looked at what kind of projectile.
The ammunition associated with those rifles is a 7.62 by 39 caliber cartridge, which is a military rifle cartridge.
And you're familiar with this cartridge, right?
I am.
Have you ever testified about the distance that this cartridge can harm somebody?
I have had a long distance shooting case with this type of rifle involved.
How far of a distance was involved in that case?
In this particular case, it was 796 yards, so about 8 football fields, half a mile.
From that distance, this cartridge was fired and killed somebody.
Yes.
I'm gonna ask you, I'm gonna do a little, I'm gonna ask you to put some gloves on. Your Honor, can I have Ianza, help out? Can you grab the gun for us? And can you get, we're gonna show you what's been admitted as Government Exhibit 101. To you, I think you refer to it as 21JA. Does that sound familiar?
It does.
As they're getting the gun ready, you had, you came down to Arizona to do the analysis in this case, right?
I did.
Right, and walk us through, like, where'd you go and who'd you meet with?
Went to a local shooting range. The sheriff's office met me there with the evidence, and I examined the rifle, test fired the rifle, and looked at the ammunition that was collected.
And then, I mean, the rifle and stuff, what condition was it when you first saw it?
It was in a sealed condition with, I think, the box that you'll see here in a second. It was sealed by the sheriff's office, and then when I was done with my examination, I resealed it with my green evidence.
Okay. And as detective is he performing the same task as you saw him do when you came down to Arizona?
I couldn't see him, but probably.
You use a pen, not use some scissors. Permission to approach the witness room? You can just open the box right there. Permission, Your Honor, for the witness to step down to review the exhibit. Go ahead, Rick, put those gloves on. Oh, you did. You anticipated. Rick, I want you to take a look at what's in Government Exhibit 101. What do you see in there?
Exhibit 101 was the rifle that I examined in this case.
Do you recognize, like, the strap, recognize certain features, the strap, things like that about the rifle?
Well, the main feature is the evidence tape that I placed on it during my exam. It has my initials and date on it.
All right, I'm gonna walk us through how you measure operability and the functionality of the weapon when you review it. You can pick it up yet. Permission, I'm sorry, permission. Thank you.
So in my right hand is the AK pattern rifle that I mentioned, State 101. And it is a semi-automatic gas-operated rifle, meaning that as the weapon is fired, there's gas assistance. So as the gas is generated by the exploding cartridge, it helps cycle the action. I'll talk about what the cycling is. So cartridges are loaded in a box magazine. We have one, and it's inserted in the base here. And then the operator will pull this handle, the bolt, the charging handle, to the rear, release it, and that will strip a cartridge off of the magazine into the chamber, and now it's ready to fire. When the trigger is pulled, safety is off, the cartridge will go down, the bullet will go down the barrel, the cartridge case will...
Object to narrative, and I don't believe it's responsive to the question.
You're asking to explain to.
So as the trigger is pulled, the primer is struck, which we'll talk about, but it's the component of the cartridge that ignites the powder. As the powder burns, it generates gas. That gas expands, creating pressure, and that pressure is what pushes the bullet out the barrel to the target. And then also some of that gas helps cycle the action, meaning There's a tube that pushes the bolt to the rear, which helps extract and eject that fired cartridge case. Bolt comes forward again, stripping a new cartridge off of the magazine into the chamber. And that process will happen as fast as you can pull the trigger. This is semi-automatic, meaning for each trigger pull, one shot is fired. So if you held the trigger down on this particular rifle, it would just fire one time. It's not a machine gun, but it is based off of machine gun design.
And how big of a magazine is that weapon hold?
They're typically 30-round magazines, but you can get different numbers of cartridges for different sizes of magazines.
Is there sighting on that weapon?
There is. There's a rear sight here, has a button that can be adjusted. So again, this is a military type rifle, so occasionally you might want to do, say, suppressive fire to longer range. So you can move this ladder sight for your different ranges that you might shoot.
And is there a rear sight?
That is the rear sight.
Oh, I'm sorry. Wasn't tracking there. Sorry about that. And anything else about the weapon that's noteworthy for the jury?
Not necessarily. This is a pretty standard AK pattern rifle that I would expect to see in the laboratory.
Does that look about the same condition that you had it when you tested it in Arizona?
It does. All these black straps that you see holding the action in place are ones that I put there after I examined it.
You can put that down. You can. Go ahead. Do you recall when you came to Arizona to test that gun?
I do recall, yes.
When was it?
Oh, it was 7/7 of 23.
So that's July 7th of last year?
Yes.
Warmer here in July than in Seattle, right?
It was uncomfortably warm when I was here.
You also looked at some ammunition, right?
I did.
You used some ammunition, correct?
I used ammunition in evidence for the test firing.
Did you compare, so there's two different sets of ammunition I want to talk about. Well, I'm sorry, ammunition and there's some shell casings, right? I want to keep these two things separate.
Okay.
Am I getting it right? I'm getting it right.
Yes, the shell casings would be what's left after the bullet's gone down range, and typically the fired cartridge case is what we call it, would be around where the shooter was. So it's automatically extracted and ejected, like I previously mentioned, so it kind of lands on the ground somewhere where the shooter was, and bullet is downrange. So a cartridge case would be fired, ammunition would be unfired with the bullet still in the case.
Just 1 second, I'm grabbing it. Do you recall the manufacturer of the ammunition that you reviewed, that you used?
The manufacturer is stamped onto the base of the cartridge case. And in this case, it stated Wolf, W-O-L-F, and that is a common manufacturer of this type of ammunition.
You also reviewed some, you got that from the sheriff's department?
I did.
Do you remember what item number it was?
I have to check my report.
Go ahead and refresh your recollection, look at your report.
The ammunition I used was item number 5, J as in John, A as in Adam.
So we'll just show. Actually, I'm gonna have you don't still have your gloves on, do you? I'll do it. I'm sure it was been part of exhibit 101. We'll show you an envelope for 101. left so you can open that up. Can you do two things at once as you're opening it up?
I can.
Those show, you're gonna be opening up an envelope, there's gonna have some items in there. Those items, did you put any items in the box when you finish your analysis and testing?
I did not. I resealed my test back in the packaging that the ammunition came from.
Okay. Why don't you open that up?
Okay, it's open.
Take a peek inside. Do you recognize what's inside?
These appear to be test fires from the Rifle 101.
What's those are shell casings?
Yes, just fire cartridge cases.
All right, and approximately how many are in there?
I'll have to count them. Can we count them?
Sure, you can count them. Okay.
More than two. It's like 10.
10. And are those the shell casings similar to the ones found on the scene that, in this case?
They are. They are 7.62 by 39 caliber Wolf brand cartridge cases.
And those are the ones that you use to test this weapon.
I use that same type to test this firearm.
I see the benefit of using a bigger table here. I'm going to show you in Government Exhibit 34. I'll show you image 4434. Just for, well, it's going to be. You see that image? Can we zoom in?
I can't see it.
What does that look like? What image does that look like?
Well, just based on my training experience and knowing what this is, it is likely a 7.62 by 39 caliber cartridge case.
I'll show you image 4435. Same thing?
Yes, 4435 appears to be also a 7.62 by 39 caliber cartridge case.
And those match or similar to the ones in the envelope, right?
Yes, appear to be same caliber cartridge type and make of the casing itself.
I'm going to show you what's been marked as, and you reviewed crime scene photos, correct?
I did.
I'm going to show you what's been marked as same exhibit 34, but image 4438. Recognize that?
I do.
Maybe publish to the jury. On agreement with counsel.
And just, it's subject to the stipulation that we talked about earlier today.
Talk to the jury a little more about that.
I think that'd be helpful. To just explain to the jury.
Oh, all right, so this is what I was talking to you about before, taking witness out of order. Now, remember also, we talked about any exhibit that comes into evidence that the court admits, there has to be what we call foundation. So witnesses got to come in and testify to establish that this, whatever the item is relevant to this case. So, for example, if there's I'm just making this up, okay? This is not in this case. If there's a bullet found or a casing found this witness is about to testify to his opinion about some of that. Someone's got to come in. Someone's got to come in and say, that was a bullet or casing or whatever that was found at the scene of this alleged crime, not just some random bullet or casing that they found. So that's foundational. That's an example of foundation. Someone's got to come in and testify. Whatever this gentleman's going to testify to is something that relates to this case, like the casing that was found at the scene. So in order to get this gentleman on and make sure we finish his testimony so he can get on his way this afternoon or today, there's an agreement we call stipulation. We had a preliminary instruction about that. A stipulation is nothing more than agreement between the parties, state and defense, that this witness can be taken out of order and that this, what's now going to be portrayed to you, there has been no foundation yet established to it as to what it is and where it was taken. But the defense has agreed with the state that we can take this gentleman out of order, but there will be required to be a witness who will come in at a later time to establish that foundation, which is usually established before the witness testifies. Okay? Good enough?
Yes.
Any questions about that? Thank you. All right. You can go forward. It can be published. This is Exhibit 34, page 44, 38.
Correct. What are we seeing here, Rick?
What you're seeing in this photograph is the documentation of the fire cartridge cases that were ultimately collected as evidence.
I'm gonna go back to, believe it or not, that was the very first one I wanted to show. I'm gonna go back to images 4434 and 4435. That's the image we just saw together, right?
Yes,
Right, and you still have the envelope in front of you, right?
I do.
Still got your gloves on?
I do.
All right. Can you hold up one of the shell casings in that envelope? Do like a little thing like that for everyone? And Greg, can you just stand up a little bit so you can walk the perimeter there? Sure. Thank you, Rick. That shell casing is similar to the one in 4434.
It is.
Just so, because I talked about this one too. I showed you 4435. That one too, right?
Yes.
And finally, four, 436.
4436 also appears to be a 7.62 by 39 caliber cartridge case.
Just one more of those. I'm gonna zoom in.
I can see it.
You see it? You can draw on that screen. You want to circle it, top left-hand corner to activate it. Then you can put a circle around where it's at. There's a little stylus there. Can I just point it to you, Rick?
Sure.
Is this the image right there?
It is.
Okay, so it's the bottom left of that image, right?
Like the 9 o'clock position of that photograph.
That's a fair way to describe it. 9 o'clock position. all that teaching now and gonna take it away from you. Do you know approximately how many shell casings there were found on scene?
I think there are ultimately 9.
Just so I can show the 4439 again. Those shell cases we just saw in those images, they're from this scene, right?
Yes.
And what are those little yellow things? Just little tents, what are those?
Those are pretty standard evidence markers that I see in most of my crime scenes.
They're just marking where the casings are found, right?
Yes, and there's photographic scales on them. Photographs of them.
Yeah, somebody else saying that
Show you 44, same exhibit, image 44,
saying they can't hear the volume very well.
different image of what we just saw.
Yeah, 4440 appears to be the same image, different area taken from a different perspective.
We're gonna do a close-up, real close-up here. What you see on, this is exhibit 34, image 4442. What do you see on that?
4442 appears to be another photograph of a fired 7.62 by 39mm cartridge case.
And just so we have point of reference, you see the number 1 on there?
I do.
You see the number 1 on the screen?
I do.
Okay. It's a closer shot with someone's hand. You see that?
Yes.
That's 4443. Just gonna just do one more for illustrative. Image 4444. See that image?
I do. 4444 is another fired cartridge case.
With the marking number 2 next to it?
Yes.
And all those these showcases you're seeing match the one that's in that envelope, right?
Appear to be the same type and caliber.
When you came down to Arizona, your goal was to check the operability and the functionality of the weapon.
Yes.
Explain to the jury what that entailed.
Simply examining it and test firing. And part of the examination is look for defects or alterations to the firearm. Of course, any safety concerns of firing the firearm. And ensuring that the magazine fits in chambers and cycles properly.
Recall any functionality issues with the weapon?
No.
Any defects with the weapon?
No.
In your opinion, did it operate as intended?
It did.
And you test fired that weapon?
I did.
And how'd you, what goes into the test firing of the weapon?
Pretty simple. After my examination, I checked the board to be sure there's no obstructions inside the barrel. That could be bad. And I had ammunition there from evidence, so I used that. I used the magazine from evidence and test fired like anyone would fire a firearm.
And with this weapon, when you tested it, how far were you away when you tested it?
I did set up some panels a little over 100 yards away to shoot at. Have a target base. And those shots were fired from a rest, meaning the stand that I placed the firearm in, and everything functioned properly.
Why'd you pick a little bit over 100 yards?
Well, I knew that was the approximate distance of question here, and I also wanted to see if the bullet was stable in flight at that range. And that's something I've seen, especially some of the AK pattern rifles, is they're fired so many times that the rifling are spiral cuts in the barrel to give the bullet stability in flight, like a football. And if that rifling is damaged or altered or corroded, it affects the flight of the bullet. So that was one of the things that I wanted to test while I was here. Was that bullet stable at that distance? Meaning, is it making nice clean holes into my target?
I'm just going to show you, it's going to be marked as government exhibits 74, 103 to 110. And I want you to do you have scissors still up there?
I do.
You have your glove on still? Yeah, learning. Thanks, Rick.
I am learning.
Permission to approach her? You mind opening up Government Exhibit 74?
Inside 74 is another envelope. You want me to open that one?
I do. Thank you. Thank you, Rick.
74 was marked item 1, J as in John, A as in Adam. Inside that second envelope is the fired cartridges.
Can you put it up?
Appears to be, well, it is 7.62 by 39 millimeter fired cartridge case with the wolf head stand.
I know you can't talk about, but does that look like a similar image of one of the rounds or spent shell casings in the images we saw?
It appears to be the same caliber and type.
Okay, I'm not going to ask you to do all of these, but open up exhibit 10. There's a bigger envelope that says 103 to 106. Just open that package up, and I just want you to just look at it. Just give me one of those in there, and we'll do the same thing with just one of those in there. Oh, does that make sense? Does that make sense?
I said, okay, yes, got you. So Stacy's exhibit 103 to 106. Those are my item numbers for the purposes of my report. 22JA, 23JA, 24JA, 25JA.
Don't take a while. Sorry. Which one are you going to show me?
So the envelope I pulled out was 105.
Can you just open up 105 for me? Oh, I'm sorry. Is it open?
Yes.
Take it out and show it to the jury for me. And what does that look like?
This is another 7.62 by 39 fired cartridge case with wolf headstand.
And I know you can't testify to this because you weren't there, but does that look like one of the same rounds that was in the images I showed you?
Appears to be the same caliber and cartridge type.
Very nice. Can you put 105 back in that bigger envelope? Permission to take that to back up. So I just want to make sure we all understand the sequence of events we just went through. The shell casings that were located with State Exhibit 101, aesthetic shell casings. Got that in your head?
Yes.
They match the ones that we just saw in Government Exhibit 74, and I think you looked at Government Exhibit 105.
Yes, they all appear to be Wolf brands, 7.62 by 39 millimeter fired cartridge cases.
And those appear to match the ones on the photograph.
Well, match means something different to me than to you.
I'm
They
sorry.
appear to be similar in make and model.
Thanks for clarifying. Appear to be similar. When you fire the Government Exhibit 101, which is the AK, I'm just going to call it the AK. Is that? When you fired the AK, you testified no functionality issues, correct?
Correct.
No operation issues.
Correct.
And did the projectile come out of the gun in the intended fashion?
It did.
Straight?
Yes.
And just so I understand, this weapon and those projectiles, you looked at autopsy pictures, right?
I do.
You also looked at clothing pictures of the victim.
I did.
I'm going to show you Government Exhibit 14.2, image 6350, under the same conditions as before with the fence. I'll show us first so defense can see what I'm showing.
And for the record, again, same, I guess, deferred objection pending foundation.
Move to publish for the jury. You see, let me zoom out. What's this an image of?
This image is a photograph taken by a medical examiner, as I believe it to be, the entrance wound.
Anything unique about that entrance room considering this weapon and those projectiles?
Well, in my opinion, this wound appears to be irregular, meaning not circular.
Is it helpful to draw why it's irregular versus circular?
Sure, I'll draw it to the side, but you expect to see a circular oval. Apologize for the drawing here, but I'm looking for a clean circular hole, and this is not. It's a, call it an irregular hole or oval shaped defect,
And you also looked at,
and this is not. It's a, call it an irregular hole or oval shaped defect.
and you also looked at the clothing of the victim, correct?
Yes,
You saw the entry room for the entry hole of the victim's clothing.
yes, the bullet defect in the victim's clothing.
And what was anything special about the entry hole, the victim's clothing?
As with the autopsy photo, the clothing also exhibited irregular type defect.
So this is in your report. I just want to show you the image that you looked at. You also looked at some of the clothing, but this is one of the images that you looked at, right?
Yes.
Right. And do you recall where the entry was on this photo?
Where it does that, let's identify.
Oh, sorry about that. Exhibit 35, image 028.
In this photograph, photograph the decedent as he was located. And you're asking about the entrance
Yeah, do you recall?
of the right flank, meaning the right side.
On the page, your little
Oh.
picture thing? Where all the staining is at, right?
Yes, where blood deposition is.
Just so I understand, that gun and those projectiles can cause this injury from 100 and 100 plus yards.
In my opinion, yes.
And the design, talk about this, the design of that projectile, what's the purpose of that projectile, design of that projectile?
The 7.62 by 39 cartridge is a military cartridge, as I mentioned earlier. And military cartridges are designed not to fragment, meaning they're full metal jackets. And the idea being, if, again, this is historic, but from my understanding, the idea being for that is if you wound someone on the battlefield, it takes 2 people to take that person off the battlefield. So the idea is you want the bullet to perforate, meaning go all the way through the target, and that's what these cartridges are designed to do. Whereas your law enforcement type of bullets are designed to enter and not exit, meaning expand, deposit all their energy into the target. So there's lots of classes, but there's 2 major classes of bullets that I see: full metal jackets, or ball ammo, like we're seeing here, and then jacketed hollow points or soft points, which are designed to fragment in the body.
And from a little bit over 100 yards away, using the AK and those rounds, what would you expect to happen with this projectile hitting a body?
Unless it hit a major structure like the spine, I would expect it to enter and exit, meaning perforate the body.
To go back to is there a technical term for what's happening with this round as it enters the body?
Oh, I thought I already used the technical term.
Is there a technical term for it?
Well, it's an irregular entrance one. So one term could be used if the bullet's in yaw, meaning it's not stable. It's flying irregularly. And so one example of that would be ricochet sound you hear in the movies. That's a bullet in yaw. As it's spinning through the air, it's making a whirring sound. It's not stable. It's not flying straight. So that's one of the technical terms we use to describe potentially the bullet behavior going here. The bullet is in yaw and not flying straight.
And so your opinion is this entry wound is created by a bullet in yaw.
Well, what causes a bullet to be in yaw could be intermediate object. So I published a paper and actually presented on this very topic where a bullet would strike something even slightly, and that impact would create the yaw, meaning knock the bullet out of its stable flight that it has. And I think, in my opinion, I think that's what's occurring here.
And you fired this weapon, right? So without anything interfering from the weapon to the target, right? Nothing in between.
I did. When I fired it, I did not impact any intermediate objects intentionally.
Any yaw?
No, all of my witness panels that I fired, my targets all had clean holes or defects, meaning the bullet was stable.
And you're familiar with this scene here, right? You're familiar with the topography, the trees, the landscapes?
I am. I did look at the scan data.
And are there things in this scene that can create yaw of a bullet that's been fired?
I would say not several, but many mesquite trees. They were at the scene that I saw on the point cloud and on the crime scene photos and on the drone footage to indicate that yes, there's any objects between the house and the decedent.
And so, explain to the jury if a bullet fired from this weapon, that round, from that distance, if it hits a trunk, it's gonna stop the bullet, right? If it hits a trunk?
Tree trunk or car trunk?
Oh, good question. Tree trunk.
Yes, or a branch. I mean, anything that could can just deviate it from its flight.
In this bullet, with the velocity it has, it can go through a branch, it can go through obviously twigs or things like that, right?
Yes,
But any of those things can cause a yaw,
yes.
and it would still continue on its flight path, right?
Generally, it depends on how destabilizable it is, how much it will deviate from the flight path.
And when you looked at this weapon, this AK-47, do you recall citing and what was cited for?
As I stated, that you can adjust that rear sight with a little button, which it slides the rear sight up and down. And there's a P setting, which is the general purpose setting. Forgot what the P stands for, it's in another language. But typically, my understanding is it's a 300-yard zero, meaning it should be point aim, point of impact at 300 yards. And that's up for debate, depending on the rifle and how it's set up.
So that as you received it and as you tested that weapon was cited for 300 yards.
It had the P, it was in the P setting when I looked at it. Yes.
By me, I had a question. Could this injury, go back, how do I do that? This injury, could it be what we call bullet fall? You know what bullet, am I using a layman's way of explaining that?
This is something I explored in my 800-yard case, and in my opinion, no, this could not be bullet fall.
What's bullet fall, so we can explain?
So there's an angle for which you can fire a rifle or a pistol, which would be the maximum range. Gravity versus velocity of the bullet. And so most firearms, it's about 33, 35 degrees. So if you hold it 35 degrees, it's going to go its maximum distance that it can. If you go beyond 30 degrees, it's going to run out of velocity and then it's going to start falling. And it's going to lose its velocity. So I did extensive testing on that. And there's published papers on this too when I had my 800-yard case. And so a falling bullet only is about 180 feet per second, about enough to, I mean, if you shot it straight in the air and it came down, it's about enough to give you a knot on your head or a bruise on your shoulder. It typically won't, if it penetrates, it'll be very superficial because it's just velocity that it has is just from gravity as it's falling. And so anything beyond 30, 40, 50 degrees, it's going to be a falling bullet and not velocity from the shot itself. Hope that makes sense.
Yeah, so when you look at that wound, is this, I think you, I just want to make sure I understand. When you look at that wound, look at this weapon, and look at the shell casings and the rounds projectile used. Is this a result of a bullet fall, or is this a result of a weapon, the projectile being still on its trajectory at full velocity?
It's my opinion that this was a direct fire shot and not a falling bullet.
You also looked at, you also gave an opinion about whether or not this was possible handgun or a close range shot. Do you recall that?
Yes.
Walk the jury through what your opinion is about whether or not this is a close range shot or a long shot.
Well, there would be two things we're looking for a close range shot. One, I mentioned earlier, there is rapidly expanding gas that pushes the bullet down the barrel. And that gas has to go somewhere. So it usually follows and sometimes precedes the bullet as it comes out of the barrel. So that gas has residue that can be chemically tested. There's also unfired gunpowder that's contained within that gas cloud. And if you're close enough, that will deposit itself on the target, clothing, the wound, etc. And so we can test for that. Secondly, we have an irregular wound and we know that this firearm fires stray bullets. So something would have had to come in between the shooter and the victim to destabilize that bullet in the path that it would take. So those would be the two things that we would look for a close range shot. Additionally, a pistol round, typically, based on my experience, when unstable pistol rounds hit people, they don't exit because they lose all their energy as they are unstable flying through the air. Now, this being a military cartridge, much higher velocity, much smaller bullet, so it can be unstable and still manage to perforate a person. So all of those factors, again, was my opinion, it was the distance shot from a rifle.
You had that one case earlier, 800 yards away, approximately.
Yes.
Did that bullet exit the victim in that case?
It did not. It penetrated around her armpits and went through her heart and almost exited on her left side.
So distance does matter whether or not there's enough velocity for this type of bullet to enter and then exit.
Certainly, and it did lose, obviously, some velocity traveling 800 yards, but still was lethal at that distance.
And you're, in this scenario, in this case, that distance, 100, a little bit over 100 yards, was enough, it's short enough distance for that gun, for that round to penetrate and exit.
Yes.
In your opinion, it was a long rifle that shot that round that killed this victim.
The wound is consistent to a rifle round.
May I also ask you, you considered the ejection pattern? Did you review the ejection pattern and that the DPS did in this case?
I did.
And they did their own testing of the weapon, right?
Yes.
And you reviewed that ejection pattern?
I did, and I saw a similar ejection pattern, although I didn't map it when I was doing my own test fire.
So essentially, we have three possible ejection patterns. We've got the crime scene, we've got DPS, and we have yours.
Yes.
All right. All three of those ejection patterns, are they similar using this weapon?
Well, I'm not sure where the shooter was specifically. So when we do our testing, we know right where the firearm is versus the pattern. But the pattern size was similar in all three areas. It's some dispersion and typically to the right of the firearm. And that's been my experience with these types of firearms.
Just 1 second, Ryan, I need to grab a photo. Just 1 second. I'm gonna try to do this with this photo. See if we've got a decent photo here. I'll show you what's been marked as State Exhibit 34, image 4440. You see that, Rick?
Yes.
And that is, would that be similar to like an ejection pattern? These are, just so we all understand what we're looking at, these are markings, yellow markings, right?
Yes.
And I know you were not here, but assuming those markings are with spent shell casings, right?
Yes.
If someone's standing, you see where the detectives are? If someone's standing to the 3 o'clock side to that, you see the 3 o'clock? Can you just draw on the map 3 o'clock where the shell casings are on the far side of the photo? Yeah, something like that, right? Somewhere close to that range, right? Would those shell casings, that ejection pattern be conducive, be what we would possibly see from someone standing in that position firing that weapon?
Yes, could be.
And it's like brick and patio, do you see that? See where the detectives are standing or the officers are standing?
I do.
And you don't know this, but that looks like a patio deck, right?
It is a patio deck. I've looked at the 3D scanning there, and I'm familiar with the area.
Okay. So you understand we're referencing to cones? You've never seen cones or seeing on a 3D scan?
Yes.
The jury has seen cones. They've seen plenty of photos with cones in it. And so we're talking about the cones on the patio deck, right?
Yes.
And if a shooter is standing at that location, firing that weapon with those rounds, would this be a ejection pattern that you could see, that could result?
It is consistent.
Where'd you get for your 3D scan, where'd you get the data for that 3D scan?
Arizona DPS did the scanning. The process for that is essentially a magic box on a stick, on a tripod, and you put it out.
I think he's answered the question.
He did. Did you also get like a scan plan? Did they give you a scan plan for that or no?
I did the scan plan and provided it to them.
No, they did, with DPS, when they provide you the raw data?
Yes.
They provide you any documentation to go with it?
All I wanted was the raw data so I could
Oh.
register it myself.
And you prepared the output for the 3D scan?
Yes.
What was the distance from your 3D scan? What was the distance from the patio, from the cone to where the victim's body was found?
It was consistent with the measurement that the drone had already measured. So I just confirmed that measurement.
Would 350 feet sound familiar?
Yes.
Before I get to my final few questions, so with the ejection pattern, type of weapon, the rounds, can we just call them wolf rounds? Can I just say wolf?
Sure.
Wolf rounds, the wound, and the clothing. What's your opinion about where the shooter was in this case?
All the evidence I looked at is consistent with the shooter standing on that porch, or that, based on the physical evidence that I looked at that I'm aware of, the shot could have come from the porch.
Just 1 second, Your Honor. We're almost done, Rick. I have to show you something. It wasn't with my. Is it witness? Yeah. We're having an item brought in, one of the shell casings that you use to get the lot number and so forth.
Okay.
As you're getting at, Rick, and so the round that entered the victim's body and exited, do you know what happened to it?
To my knowledge, it was not recovered.
May we have a quick picture?
30-minute recess. I'm going to stay here. It's about when we take our midweek recess. We'll take a 30-minute recess. I'll stay for the lawyers.
All right. Good morning, everyone. At least here in Colorado, we are watching the trial of Mr. George Kelly, the rancher down there in Arizona, who's obviously been accused of killing a man that was on his property. I put it in the chat here just a second ago, and the Arizona statute is pretty straightforward, although Arizona has this, if you're the initial aggressor, then you must retreat before you can continue to engage. But the statute is rather clear. So let me tell you what it is here. Except as provided in subsection B, a person is justified threatening or using physical force against another when and to the extent a reasonable person would believe. Hold on. Okay. The prosecutor saying that somehow on the live feed, the jurors were being shown. I don't recall seeing that, at least not while I've been watching. Let me tell you, usually there's no bigger bunch of busybodies. Okay, so another investigator called the investigator there that said at some point somebody scanned on the live feed and showed two jurors. I don't remember seeing that.
Let me check.
I'm sure you're aware of the rules, right? Video,
Well, there was a moment where I was panning and I was not fully paying attention, and I just briefly saw, and they were blurred out, a couple of jurors right here. And the moment I noticed, I panned back. And when it happened, I was like, oh gosh. And I was like, okay, I need to pay more attention because I know that's a rule and I didn't need to do it. I apologize.
All right. Well, I don't think there's anything you can do about that. Person who's operating the cameras well within the rules, just explain what happened. Just be very careful in the future so it doesn't happen again. Does anyone want to inform the two jurors?
I was gonna say anybody can come into the courtroom and see who the jurors are. I just never understand why all this secrecy about the juries.
I just found out this before, so I just wanted to make sure the camera folks knew that they were having an issue. I'm like, sure.
I agree. We don't know the rules, and that's the rules. Just happen once.
Just once, when I saw it happen, I was like, oh gosh, nope, need to pay more attention. I apologize.
So it's not that happened, but the camera person knows what has to be done. It's a one-time thing where swung the camera a couple millimeters too far to the right. So,
Yeah, this one I was trying to film the yes, I was like panning over and it just went.
well, maybe, And I don't know if it happened when he gets down, just when he gets down, just walk across, or any other words, gets down. No problem. All right, any other record anyone wants to make? Okay, so we'll come back in about, let's make it about 20 minutes.
Okay, so now we have a 20-minute break in the case of George Allen Kelly, the 70-something-year-old rancher who is charged with killing a man on his property. As we were talking about, can you turn off that background volume, Frank? From the courtroom? Yeah, thanks. So Mr. Kelly's on trial, first week of the trial, and usually a case like this, it's not a whodunit. It's not. We all know it's Mr. Kelly. He's the one that shot the individual. What I was talking about a minute ago is whether this was reasonable. That is going to be the big issue. Okay. So the statute 13-404, self-defense in Arizona, says except as provided in subsection B of this section, a person is justified in threatening or using physical force against another when and to the extent a reasonable person would believe that physical force is immediately necessary to protect himself against the use or attempted use of unlawful physical force. So there you go. That's the key. Immediately necessary to protect himself against the other's use or attempted use of unlawful physical force. Now, obviously, if somebody is shooting at you, you can shoot back, even if they're a couple football fields away. If they're not armed and they're just crossing your property, could be a little more problematic, say, if you were the defendant in this particular case. So the other part of this subsection of the statute doesn't really apply, but subsection B says the use of physical force against another is not justified, first, in response to verbal provocation alone. So if you're getting into a shouting match, you're never justified in shooting somebody, or to resist an arrest that the person knows or should known is being made by a peace officer or by a person acting in a peace officer's presence and at his direction, whether the arrest is lawful or unlawful, unless the physical force used by the peace officer exceeds that allowed by law. What does that mean? You can't resist an arrest. You have to go fight it in court. You don't get to say, I'm going to beat the cop up because it's an unlawful arrest. Can't do that. Third provision, when deadly force is not justified, if the person provoked the other's use or attempted use of the unlawful physical force, unless A, the person withdraws from the encounter or clearly communicates to others his intent to do so, reasonably believing he cannot safely withdraw from the encounter, and the others nevertheless continues or attempted to use unlawful physical force. So Arizona has this, what they refer to as the initial aggressor. So if I go up and start somebody and say, I'm going to kick your butt, and maybe you have a gun, maybe you threaten them, you menace it by showing, look, I have a gun. And they say, oh, okay. Oh, I got a knife, and they have a gun, right? And you say, whoa, I only brought a knife to a gunfight. Sorry, I'm out, guys. We'll see you some other time. At that point, you're an initial aggressor, you're withdrawing, but if they come after you, then you can use deadly force to protect yourself. It gets kind of tricky. It would be a lot easier if the law simply said you can use deadly force to defend your personal property. If anybody comes on your land, you're trespassing. Maybe the laws of the Old West, but no matter how much you may like those laws, you don't normally get to shoot people just for trespassing on your land. Remember, growing up, you always saw the land, trespassers will be shot. Well, the laws changed a little bit. You used to be able to do that. Now, maybe, just maybe, the world would be a better place if you got to use deadly force to protect your property. Although there's always going to be the extreme circumstances where somebody takes it to the extreme and then somebody overreacts, change the law, and next thing you know, you can't defend yourself ever unless literally somebody just comes up and starts attacking you. Thank goodness we still have the home. Now, I'm not trying to give Mr. Kelly legal advice here, but but he'd been in contact with the border people. Apparently they had a pretty good working relationship because something about his horses, right? And in this particular case, he calls and says, "Hey, I'm being shot at." But then he says, "Hey, you really need to get out here. We got a problem. There's like a dead body out here." And that was it. Now, I'm not telling, because I would never, ever, would not advise anybody to do this ever. But you're out in the desert, somebody's dead. The people that are coming across the border probably not going to be too proactive to, run and contact Border Patrol. Who knows what happens in the desert? Now, I'm not saying he should have done that, but just, think of it. It is what it is. Or obviously you wait until they come into the residence because in most states, once they come into the house, you can do that. Now, you can't shoot somebody and then drag them into the house. Okay. You could, but you got to, you'd have to cover up all the marks, the drag marks. You couldn't have that. You'd have to pick up all your casings. It'd be very, very complicated. Now, looking back in hindsight, we'll have to wait and see exactly what Mr. Kelly testifies to. But if he had called me and I was his attorney, I would say, don't shoot. If he had called me before shooting, I say, don't shoot. It may appear as though you may not be in fear of immediate fear of death or serious bodily injury, or as the Arizona statute reads, that immediate necessary to protect himself against the other's use or attempted use of unlawful physical force. Have to wait and see, I guess. I don't know. This is a tough. Listen, clearly the prosecutors have to have a good faith basis to bringing this case. All right. Whether it's for political reasons, what have you. The case didn't get just thrown out because obviously the prosecution can bring the charges. They've done their investigation. Now it's up to a jury. It's just one of those situations. You get into much bigger, and we're not going to try to get too political here, but you have a situation where there is no southern border anymore, and people just keep cutting across it. These ranchers have these properties. They're allowed to, the quiet, peaceful use and enjoyment of their property, and shouldn't have people going back and forth upon it. If it were up to me, I could probably solve the border crisis rather quickly. Involves the United States military, and it involves interlocking fields of fire, right? So little fighting hole, and the machine gun pits all interlocked so they can boom. And if somebody crosses the line, then you could do that. But then, are they using physical force? No, you probably have to pass a law saying that if they're coming across the border illegally, because we wouldn't want our people in the military to go to prison. Or another possibility is, you could just try to shut it down. Just reasonable, not unreasonable thing. And if somebody has legitimate amnesty claims, they could apply for them in Mexico. I think that's the way it was for a while there. And obviously, amnesty is it's a legal route to not be returned to your country of origin if you have legitimate fear of political repercussions because of your political views or religious views, where you're actually going to be persecuted, not just because it's a poor country and you would like to have a better life. Who doesn't want a better life? I get it. If I lived in a lot of these countries, there was not a whole lot of great opportunity. I too would want to come to America, and it's the type of situation. But there are laws, and if you don't enforce the laws, or at least make people comply with them, it can be very problematic, as we can see. So George Kelly, like I said, he has got a bit of an issue. I get it. He's old. It's a matter of principle. But this is not a slam dunk case for either party. It is the type of situation, and this could go either way. If you have enough jurors that say, "Oh, Mr. Kelly, man, I'm sympathetic to your cause, but I just don't see how you were in true danger. You could have gone to the house. You could have called," and that's the whole thing. And that's why the law, these legislators, I swear to God, I'm telling you, if you ever have any interaction with most state legislators, they're the biggest bunch of buffoons you have ever met in your life. Not a single one of them actually write a bill. They're all written by lobbying organizations. They literally, and all the lobbyists take the legislation, and then they take it all to the other states, and they find people sympathetic to their situation, and then they do this. And the language is poorly drafted. They use poorly drafted language, and it creates issues where people don't know what the heck is going on. Anytime you're dealing with the law, you want certainty, right? If I do this, I'm not going to get in trouble. If you do this, you are going to get in trouble. It needs to be clear. And then, they use words like, the statute here in Arizona, where it's, if a reasonable person, okay, this is the problem. And I hate reasonable person standards. We have talked about this many, many times. Okay. The reasonable person standard it's a negligence standard. It is a civil case standard, right? Negligence is, what would a reasonable person do under the same circumstances? Okay. So you have a statute here that says a person is justified in threatening or using physical force against another when and to the extent a reasonable person would believe that physical force is immediately necessary to protect himself against the other's use or attempted use of the unlawful physical force. A reasonable person. Well, obviously that's based upon local standards, right? Or is it? Or should that be, well, you're a rancher in Arizona. You have people crossing across your property all the time without permission. You never shot them all those times. So what made this case so different? Were you really being shot at? Were you not? Was it close? Were they just shooting up in the air? Who knows? Or was it some guy that lives in New York City should be the reasonable person standard that's never had a gun, never had to live out in the wild where people are crossing your property in the middle of the night, could come in and break into your house at any given time, do terrible things to your family, steal your livestock, steal your personal property as well. So it should be when the person believed they were instead of a reasonable person, it should be that the person, the defendant charged, would believe that physical force is immediately necessary to protect himself. That should be the standard. But I hate when legislators do this crap of reasonable person standard. You know what? Then, don't even make it a crime. If what a reasonable person would do, then it should just be a civil violation, right? It should not be an objective standard. It should be a subjective standard. What is that person feeling? You know what? You had to be there. And for everybody to come back and sit there and play armchair quarterback and say a year later, well, we know all this information now. But guess what? Mr. Kelly or any person being charged when it's a self-defense claim. They may not know a lot of things, but what they knew at that particular time is that they were scared to death. They were in fear of unlawful physical force against him or his family member, and they took the action that they deemed necessary. Like I said, now we have all this armchair quarterback stuff coming, over a year later, saying, well, we looked at this and the distance and the wind speed and blah, 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 blah. It shouldn't matter. All right. Self-defense should be self-defense. If you've ever been in a situation where you have had to use force to defend yourself, maybe swinging back at somebody because they swing at you, pushing back, having to use a weapon of some type, you have to be there in that moment, right? What is it? Mike Tyson said, the greatest plans go out the world until that first punch in the nose, right? Things are different. You're not going to say, well, would a reasonable person step back, wait 3 seconds, see if the other man is going to retreat, or are you immediately going to defend yourself? Of course you're going to defend yourself. So, it's a double-edged sword, ladies and gentlemen. You want to be able to do it. Like I said, Arizona, I don't know. All these legislative, it's run amok. It used to be, we actually sent citizen legislators, right? They weren't career politicians. They were going to go, they were going to, for 3 months out of the year, most legislative bodies aren't in session year round. I think with a few exceptions like Arizona, and obviously the federal government seems like they're always doing something. And when you get a bunch of busybodies up there, a bunch of Karens that, something happens in the news. Oh my God, we need a new law for this. Let's change this. That is absurdity. It's ridiculous. Everybody needs a cooling off period. Some states, I think Texas, for example, they in Montana, I think they only meet every 2 years, right? So they don't have to deal with every issue that comes up in every news cycle to feel like they have to make a new law about it. Okay, so these legislators need to go back there and they need to start protecting the people. Okay, listen, I've been a criminal defense attorney for 29 years. Okay, and I'm telling you, there are certain defendants that look for weakness, right? Do you think they're going to go into the house and burglarize it if they see a bunch of cameras around? Or they have a sticker on the door that says protected by Glock? No, I'm telling you, I have spoken to many a client over the years, okay? They look for the weak. They look for the vulnerable. They look for the easy target. Okay, I'm telling you, as a not as a criminal defense attorney, but as a member of the community who's talked to a lot of criminals over the years, like, why did you pick this person? She was weak. Her hands were full. I followed her up to her apartment. I kicked in the door when, she was trying fumbling with her keys and her hands full getting in the door. And then he did terrible things. Okay. Why'd you break into that house? Right. I had a client tell me once, it was funny because they were stealing in the neighborhood in which I lived. And I was like, oh, okay. I said, just out of curiosity, I didn't tell them that I lived there. I wasn't the victim in the case, but it was in my neighborhood. And I said, well, why did you pick this particular neighborhood? He says, well, everybody in that neighborhood, they're all rich. They don't care if their property gets stolen. They're rich. I was a little offended. I was like, no, not rich. In fact, those people work really hard for those things. And when people come in and take other people's things, it sucks. And they don't use it, but they look for soft targets. They look for people that are not going to push back. Think about it. If you're a bully and a thug, do bullies go up to the biggest guy and start a fight with him? No, they always go to the weakest thing. And the law, unfortunately, like in Arizona, makes it where we are all weak and targets. And if you can't defend yourself, and there's many other states like Arizona, a lot of them are worse than Arizona. And like I said, that reasonable person standard, people, oh, Scott, you don't know what you're talking about. The Crumleys, remember? Once again, you may not like the Crumleys. I don't like the Crumleys. Obviously not great parents, right? You know, the kid that Ethan Crumley that got the gun, and they knew about it, and they were, both promptly convicted. It was a reasonable person standard. And, most jurors will say, well, I'm a reasonable person. I wouldn't have allowed this to take place. So therefore, you are wrong, Crumleys. And I'm telling you, it's a slippery slope, ladies and gentlemen. Criminal law for thousands of years has been you had to be able to prove the mental state that somebody did something intentionally, knowingly, or even recklessly. But they didn't say, well, it's a reasonable person standard. Oh, what would a reasonable person have done? Well, a reasonable person would not have robbed that store. No, it's the person went in with the intent, with a deadly weapon to take something from the other person. That's it. That's what it used to be. Actus reus, mens reus. That's prove the mental state. And the state, in an effort to become, the one to respond to all situations, has they've changed this standard. Like I said, it is offensive to me. What would a reasonable person do? Let me just see if I can pull something up here. Because it is a problem. It's getting worse. And, nobody ever listens because they all think, oh, this is great. It just, it's making the world safer. And, it's that classic situation where, it's the classic situation where it says, oh, I'll protect you. The government says, I will protect you. But in exchange for that protection, you have to give up a little something. Right. And so let me just quickly pull up just as a comparison. Arizona, what would a reasonable person do? In Colorado, for example, the definition is that you can use physical force to defend yourself and others that you reasonably believe it to be necessary to protect against imminent harm, and to use the degree of force appropriate for the situation. You don't have to withdraw under Colorado, and you're right you have to use self-defense, although you shouldn't be the initial aggressor. But it says that you use the degree of force appropriate for the situation, what you believe, and that should be the legal standard, right? Police officers, when they use self-defense, they fire till those clips are gone. All the rounds are gone in the clip, because they know how stressful it can be. You're not going to hit your target every time, but then the cops are going to come back and say, oh, it was unreasonable. You shot 5 times, 6 times. So the defense, the person shouldn't have to explain other than say, hey, I was in fear of death or serious bodily injury. And that's it. All right. We're back to the trial. Hopefully enjoyed the little commentary why we waited for the court to resume. So let's go back to it.
This is your reference in 5JA in your report. The ammunition I used.
So is this exhibit 1, 2, 3, or is it
Exhibit 1, 2, 3. This is still conditioned on the same agreement with defense counsel. So, Mr. Rick, can you look into that? You said that you can.
That is so weird, Frank. Yeah, we get 500 one day and 50,000 the next.
Yeah, that's weird.
I can't explain it.
What's your name here? What do you see here?
Exhibit 1, 2, 3, or 30.
You can go ahead and do it. Is that look like ammunition? Is that actually the ammunition you use?
Yes.
This is your exhibit. 5J.
Well, it's just exhibit, but I don't know if I like it.
I get it. That's the one that you took rounds from to test fire.
I guess so you see my evidence statement, I bring evidence statement.
You signed off on that?
Yeah, I seal the box, I bring evidence statement, and then I repack it.
And you compare the make and model of those rounds to the rounds that PS used their testing, right? Yes. And you compared those rounds in PS and then also with the spent shell casings on crime scene, right? What's your conclusion about the make and model?
All the same brand ammunition.
All the testing done in this case from PS and from you using the same make and model, both projectile round. Okay. I'm gonna show you the government exhibit 102.
I'm missing half the day. We didn't miss anything, did we?
What?
I'm looking forward to watching every day the trial goes on. Not sure why this is starting in the middle of day 2. First day was jury selection, right?
Yes.
Which wasn't televised.
Is that a comment?
Yeah.
On which one? This one?
Yeah. Why are there so many parts of this trial missing? There were opening statements. There went a whole day of silence. Then day 2 begins in the middle of cross-examination. Then the entire
Maybe the transmission, maybe the day 5 screen late. Same one.
second half day of 2 was removed from YouTube. What's that all about?
Same time. And
Second half of day 2 was removed from YouTube.
the showcasings found at the crime scene. And that magazine, you see those AK magazine? And if you know, that AK magazine, that gun?
It should, I'm not right it.
And since I'm on the grab that. I'm on the gun. Do you know the approximate dimension of the gun? Like little length barrel, about 34 inches. And the barrel, do you know? Promise you every moment. Then I'm going to show you government exhibit 34, image 419. And you see it.
Yes.
Maybe that person's confused from,
It's all there, right?
yeah, yes. I mean, the thumbnail is different though.
I do. Even though I'm not sure if we can testify to when this was collected versus the other places, right? Correct. You can't testify to the canine. No. To show you.
You see that?
Yeah.
Yeah, see, it's day one.
34 image 4485.
Let me do a playlist. I think it's.
Sorry, scratch that.
Yeah, let's do a playlist for this
I
trial.
think I did it, but let me check. It's not that, oh, okay. Yeah, everything is a play. Play, please. And.
What's that image of? Of course, those are the image of the clothing from the seasons. That you reviewed? Yes. Is there a hole in this? Yes. So the possible defect in the shirt. Can you circle it? And then looking at that hole, there's a lot of variability here, but is that sensitive to your protection, right? Looking at that hole, is that hole caused by a bullet beyond? It could be, yeah. Exhibit 34, image 4476. That close up of that same photo? Yes, 4776 is close up. Defect. Now we have a better picture of that way, right? Yes. Okay, what's, do you know what's around the hole, what the staining is? Here's the view. 447. 475.
The playlist is there with the, all the video.
And you also review the exit wound of the victim? Yes. I'm going to show you this one more thing. Go to exhibit 34, image 4487. Here we saw review for your report. Yes. And that will be consistent with a bullet in yawn? Yes. That will be, the exit will be consistent with a bullet, that's a wolf brand bullet. It's not inconsistent with a wolf brand bullet. Would that will be consistent, very consistent with a wolf brand bullet being fired from the AK-47? Could be. There was some, talk about you, there was, in your report, there was some discussion about let's talk about the yaw of the bullet, right? And you testified that yaw can be caused by something between the shooter and the victim. Typically, we refer to that as an immediate object. And you had reviewed some evidence about possible tree limb in this case, right? Yes. Tree limb that was identified in crime scene as a potential bullet site. And I'm not asking you to testify about where that tree limb was found, and what direction it was found,
And then with that, I want to show you tree limb. I should have been working here in exhibit 71. I should have government exhibit 71A. That is the remaining part of the branch, am I right? Yes. And it looks like it's been, we got some sawing the base of it off, but the top part, you certainly not that part for, I'm referring to there. That looks like it was broken off, right? So, and then, you're not here testifying to what constant concentration. Question I have for you is that branch, besides that branch, let me show you the picture. That branch, and that branch causes y'all. If around it hits that branch, then it causes y'all. Yes, that would be maybe an object that could cause y'all a bullet. And that branch just say stop the bullet, or what was just you want to let it go? I haven't done my own empirical testing of these few trees, but other trees in Washington, I would expect the branch of that diameter to not stop. That would look like a tree. That will go pretty straight. Probably on a level about 2,400 feet per second. About twice as fast as the 9mm, for example. I'm going to show you. Show you exhibit 121. Aerial view. Drone image. See that? Markings are not in the drone, the markings are for us to identify some things, but you recognize that photo? And just so we all understand each other, 421, blue is one showcasing on the right. Yes. And the yellow is remaining 8 showcasing in yellow, right? Yes. You see can you draw a circle around the cones? You see the injection pattern, right? Yes. Or result of the ejection of the casement, right? I do. If a shooter is aiming where the cones are, the injection pattern in yellow and blue is consistent with what the shooter is saying with the cones. That's our quick qualification. And also, do you know, is this the cone start for the measurement to take the flight at 350 feet? That's how I understood it. 350 divided by 3. 115. Just 1 second around. Oh, wait. Morning. I can.
So I just want to get a little bit of background information. You did not visit the
Gypsy Rose getting a divorce.
The Leica scan of that scene, is that right?
Yes.
Did you notice any differences? Were you aware, let me back up a little, that that Leica scan was taken in a significant period of time after the date of this offense?
It was.
When was the date of that scan, if you recall?
I'll have to check my report, but it was later. There were lots more leaves on the trees. I think is probably where you're going with that.
And you can check your report if you want to. Do you have that?
Yeah, let me look real quick. (6/29 of 2023) is when it was scanned.
Okay, and you mentioned there were leaves on the branches in the scan versus at the time of the event, right?
Yes.
Were there other alterations to the scene that you were aware of or made aware of?
Not that I was particularly looking at. I was more concerned with what potential line of sights you could see with the point cloud versus the crime scene
And I'm
photographs.
referring, if you remember, specifically to a prickly pear cactus. Do you recall in the photographs there being a prickly pear cactus near the area where the shell casings are located versus later that cactus is no longer there?
That does ring a bell, but I can't confirm that for sure.
Okay, but the photographs of the scene would contain more accurately what was present on the scene versus the scan. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. And you're approached by the state in this case, and you're provided with some background information about the case. Is that right?
Yes.
What background information were you provided with in a nutshell?
Well, I listed in my report several things. As I stated earlier, typically don't look at witness statements until I objectively look at the evidence to see what my impression is of what was collected and what the crime scene photos tell me. But I submitted quite a few documents to look at. But I was primarily interested in the ballistic evidence was and what the crime scene photos told me.
And from the crime scene photos and ballistic evidence, you know that there is a group of shell casings, correct?
Yes,
And that group of shell casings is located in this patio area, correct?
it is.
And you know that there is a body that was discovered at this location, correct?
Yes.
And you know, I believe, is it from the Leica scan, you know the approximate location of the body, is that correct?
Well, the drone was the initial distance determination, and then I received the Leica scan data, and what they did for the Leica scan was cone off the area where the body was recovered. Of course, the body wasn't in the scan because it had been removed. So I had an approximate location of where the body was recovered, and I compared that to the drone measurement that was taken at the time, and it was consistent.
And that's approximate, correct?
Yes,
You don't know the exact specific location of the body, correct?
I don't.
And were you told or did you receive any information that provided you with the position of the body that was discovered?
I have photographs of the decedent in place. So that, in terms of face down, face up position, is that what you mean?
Okay, well, we can start there. So you have photographs of the body, right?
Yes.
And that tells you that this body is discovered face down, correct?
Yes.
Or at least that's what the photographs show you.
My
Face down.
understanding, correct.
Did the photographs show you how that body is positioned with respect to the house or the shell casings?
I don't think so.
So do you know specifically where the entrance went, let's say? Do you know where that is positioned in relation to the house and the shell casings?
No,
You don't know where that entrance wound is?
not relative to the scene itself. There wasn't enough landmarks in those photographs for me to be able to determine where in space the body was. I mean, there was a tree nearby, so a couple of more photographs I might have been able to tell, but with what I was received, I could not.
Okay, so you don't know, for example, if the body's face down and the head is pointed towards the house, or the feet, or vice versa?
Correct, I do not know the orientation of the decedent
Okay,
at recovery.
and along those lines too, obviously you didn't know the orientation of this person prior to this person being
no data to support a conclusion on that.
And you don't know if he was running or walking or anything like that, right?
That's correct.
And you don't know if after he got shot, he moved or took a step or staggered. You don't know anything like that. Is that right?
I do not. I didn't see any evidence of bloodletting that might indicate movement after, but with a small caliber bullet such as 30 caliber, you might not see that initially. So again, there's no data to draw information or conclusions from.
Okay. And so I think you mentioned, using like a trajectory rod if there's a car with bullet holes in it, right?
Correct.
And sometimes that can give you a good idea of where this bullet came from when it hit this car. Is that correct?
Yes.
And it's fair to say that's only going to work if you know, for example, that the car was not moving, right?
Well, bullets travel fast enough that typically speaking, if the car is moving, the bullet path into the car won't change, but you don't know exactly where the car is in space. I guess that's your question.
Right.
Okay.
So it gives you approximations, right?
Yes.
Based on other factors you might know and you might not know, correct?
Yes.
And so if a person's going to be shot, for example, and you don't know where he was standing or how he was moving or what position or direction he was in before he got shot, then doing something like a rod from the wound would not be very helpful. Is that right?
Yes, well, rods and bodies aren't typically, I guess, the practice now because bodies can move so much in space and so quickly. And the upward trajectory might be flat because the person's slightly bent over, some other reasoning for that. And also, we talked about yaw with intervening objects earlier. Bullet can yaw on the body as well. And so the tissue impact could veer that bullet from its original path as it travels through the body. And I've definitely seen that experimentally and in casework. So that's another, probably, in my opinion, another reason why medical examiners don't typically put rods into bodies.
And I want to come back to that in a minute. But first I want to talk a little bit about the shell casings. That is the piece of evidence that you did examine, correct?
The casings from the scene, I actually didn't examine, just photographs only, but they were consistent with everything that was previously testified to.
Right. So you get photographs of this group of shell casings at the scene, is that correct?
Yes.
And then you're provided this weapon, right?
Yes.
And you're supposed to test this weapon to get an idea of where these shell casings land when they eject from this weapon, correct?
Well, I didn't do ejection pattern on this rifle. It was another examiner. I was just simply observing my testing on where the cartridge cases were landing, to see if it was consistent with what was previously reported, if that makes sense.
That other examiner was Aaron Brunel, is that correct?
Yes.
So he tests the weapon and he makes a determination about the pattern of the shell casings, correct?
Yes, in this case.
And you reviewed his report prior to coming to your own conclusions, is that correct?
I did.
And you also mentioned that you fired yourself this weapon from a stand, is that correct?
I did.
But you didn't draw any conclusions based on that shell casing distribution, correct?
Correct.
Is that because that was on a different kind of surface?
Well, it was two surfaces at that particular range. Right about where the ejection port was, there was concrete and there was gravel. And I wasn't set up in my one visit to do that type of examination. You have to rope it off, and I usually scan, usually 3D scan my ejection patterns. I didn't have that ability. I was simply just observing the general characteristics of where the cartridge cases were landing when I did my test.
So Aaron Brunel is the one who did the more detailed and thorough shell casing testing.
Yes, you grid it off and you have a certain height and you measure all those things.
And you agree that different surfaces can impact the way that the shell casings are distributed, correct?
Absolutely.
So for example, if we're firing a weapon and shell casings come out and it's cement, they're going to bounce around when they land on the cement, correct?
Yes.
And if on wet grass or a muddy area or something, they're not going to bounce around as much. Is that correct?
That's true.
So depending on the conditions on the ground, literally, that sort of depends how these shell casings get distributed. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And there can be other objects. We talked about intervening objects with bullets, but there can be other objects that interfere with shell casings as well, correct?
Yes.
So that prickly pear we mentioned is an object that could, for example, interfere with how those shell casings get distributed, correct?
Yes.
And all of that can interfere with a determination of how distant the shooter is from those shell casings. Is that correct?
It can.
So the best way to test, for example, is you see a crime scene and there are shell casings there. And from the shell casings, you're trying to determine how far away from that group of shell casings the person firing this weapon was standing approximately. That's what you're trying to determine, correct?
Approximate shooter location, yes.
And so if you're going to make that determination, the best practice is to test the weapon on a surface that's very similar to the surface at the crime scene, correct?
Yes,
Because otherwise it can be off significantly, correct?
yes.
Okay,
Try to control your variables.
right. And other variables involved in shell casing testing, does that include the height off the ground that the weapon is fired?
Yes.
So can you explain that a little bit? How does the height of the weapon affect a shell casing pattern distribution?
Well, think of a firearm as a system of tools that work together to fire this cartridge. And there's two pretty significant tools in the firearm that help or assist with that ejection pattern. One is called the extractor, which extracts. We're very simple in firearms. And there's an ejector that ejects. And the extractor is a hook and the ejector is a post. And as it comes to the rear, they interact with each other, and that's what causes the cartridge case to fly out of the firearm. And there's inherent variability in that. And if you were to control all the variables you could and just fire this firearm in one place, in one position, you're still going to get a little bit of distribution error, if you will. And so anything that's going to affect that interaction with the extraction and ejection could affect where they land, meaning how you're holding the firearm, what ammunition you're using, and of course what height you are off the ground.
So, and there are all different positions that people fire from too, right?
Yes.
So you could be standing and holding a rifle up at your shoulder, correct?
Yes.
Or you could be kneeling and holding that same rifle, correct?
Yes.
You could be in a prone position on your stomach and holding that same rifle, correct?
You can.
And you can be aiming up or down or anywhere in between, correct?
Yes.
Do all of those things potentially affect the shell casing distribution?
Definitely can.
And if you're holding, let's just throw another variable in there. What if you're talking about somebody who's a left-handed shooter? Can that affect the way the weapon is held?
It can. I actually haven't done any pattern testing with left-handed shooters with those kind of rifles, but I mean, anything that could be a variable on how that firearm is held could affect the potential of where they land.
Were you told in this case that the suspect was left-handed?
I believe that was mentioned at some point.
Did you adjust any of your testing to account for that variable?
I didn't do the ejection pattern testing, and my testing was done in a rest, so it wasn't right hand, left hand. It was a static rest that I placed the rifle in.
Okay, so that's a question for Aaron Brunel, who did that testing.
Yeah, save that for him.
I will do that, thank you. So when you're talking about what you can learn from a group of shell casings, for example, if you just stumble upon a group of shell casings out in the middle of nowhere, you could possibly learn what type of ammunition was fired. Is that correct?
Yes.
And you can tell that from the shell casings themselves, correct?
You can, and sometimes firearm type.
Sometimes firearm type, correct? Yes. Not always, right?
Not always.
Because many types of ammunition are compatible with multiple types of firearms, correct?
Yes.
So from the shell casings that you observed in this case, what could you determine just from looking at those shell casings? What are things that you could determine definitively, conclusively?
That they were the AK caliber, meaning 7.62 by 39. They were wolf head stamped, and they were also steel cartridge cases, which is typical for that type of weapon platform. You
say AK caliber. Are those shell casings, is that ammunition that's compatible with other types of weapons besides an AK?
Yes, there's many manufacturers that make firearms that will chamber and fire the 7.62 by 39 millimeter.
So just from looking at that group of shell casings, you don't know which weapon or which type of weapon was fired. That's correct, right?
For my examination, of course, they were sent to me. I could do a microscopic comparison and identify them to a specific firearm, but I did not do that in this case.
You can do that with shell casings?
Yes.
How accurate is that?
Well, based on my training experience, when I identify something, I'm confident that they were fired from that firearm.
Okay, and that's only if you do a specific type of testing on the shell casing, correct?
That's not to go into too much detail, but I have a comparison microscope that allows me to look at two things at the same time. So I could test fires from the rifle, I get evidence items, and I look at them simultaneously for the marks left by the system of tools that I just talked about. So the extractor will leave a mark, ejector will leave a mark, the firing pin leaves marks. And those are all individual microscopically. So that's what I'm looking at when I do comparisons.
And you didn't do that in this case, right?
Correct. Another question for Bruno.
Okay, so with what we have right now, we're not sure which weapon these shell casings came from, correct?
Correct.
Okay. And a group of shell casings, assuming you have the correct weapon for those shell casings, and assuming that you test fired that weapon, that will tell you approximately the distance that the shooter was standing when that weapon was fired, correct?
Yeah, how I report it out is I have an area of probability, and I'll draw a circle that based on where this distribution is, the shooter is probably standing in this approximate area. Given all those factors and control areas that we were talking about.
And just to do kind of a visual, so let's say there's a, can you still hear me?
I can.
Don't project that well. So let's say there's a pile of shell casings right here. And you've tested the weapon and you've determined the distance of the shooter is about this far. So imagine shell casings right there. And it tells you a distance that's approximate, right?
Yes.
So it could be a little bit over here, it could be a little bit over here, and vice versa, right?
Yes, but probably not in the corner of the room or in the hallway.
Right, so it gives you a margin of error.
Yes.
Right? And you mentioned a circle, correct?
That's how I do it. A lot of people, well, some people will do just grids and mark individual and not do an average. It just depends on the type of case and what you're trying to demonstrate.
Does this work? Is this working?
Yeah.
Okay, so if there's a shell casing pile right there, the shooter, let's say this is the distance approximate that you've determined, could be standing right here, right?
Yes.
And aiming in this direction potentially.
Yes.
But there's a whole circle around here that would also be consistent with where the shooter's standing, right?
Do you mean position of the muzzle or the bore?
The person. So shell casings are right there. Let's say this is the distance you've determined. I know it's not realistic, but person, I'm the shooter. Those are the shell casings. I'm firing the weapon, right? Shell casings are going this way. This is one position I could be standing in if the distance is correct.
Yes.
Right? But there's a whole circle that's drawn around this pile of shell casings.
So if you walk around the circle with the ejection port facing your circle, I
Right.
think I see where you're
Yes.
trying to.
So I could be standing here too, in other words.
Yes.
Right? And that's still consistent with the pile of shell casings. And I could be standing anywhere around that circle that's not obstructed, right?
Yes.
Okay. So from a pile of shell casings, you're getting a distance and you're getting a radius, basically.
Yes.
At any point along that radius, the person could be standing, correct?
If I understand your question correctly, yes.
Okay. In other words, the shell casings themselves don't determine which direction a person was aiming, right?
That's correct.
You need other evidence to look at that to determine that, correct?
Yes.
You might need actually a fixed point or a known point where the shooter was standing. Is that correct?
Or a bullet impact downrange.
A bullet impact on something that had a fixed point or a known point,
Yes.
right? Okay, so a bullet impact itself doesn't have a fixed point or a known point, right? Unless it's in something that doesn't move, correct?
Correct. Stationary object.
Right, okay. you mentioned something when you test fired the weapon. Oh, before I move on from that, describe a little bit how possibly aiming in an upward direction versus a downward direction might change the shell casing distribution piece.
Well, it's all geometry. The cartridge case is being extracted, ejected, roughly the same angle. So if you're changing the angle of the bore of that firearm, steering it so, and the distribution on this particular firearm is slightly forward of the shooter and to the right, somewhere around 15 feet or so, just on average. But so if you were, and that's from a horizontal bore, that's how the convention is to do this type of testing. Now, if you were to raise or lower that bore to not horizontal, to the ground, you're going to change that geometry of that extraction ejection and potentially affect the pattern. How much it affects the pattern, it would depend on the testing that you do. You have to do empirical testing to determine what variable, how much is that pattern distribution changing when you move the bore up and down.
And so it's possible to do empirical testing to see what changes about a specific weapon or specific shell casing distribution when you fire at various angles, right?
Sure, but again, there's a safety concern for that too. As I mentioned earlier, I killed at about 33 degrees. That's below about 2 miles almost. So you have to be sure you're in proper conditions to test that. But yes, it can be done.
Okay. And so if there are two people who dispute, let's say, the direction of fire, one of them says, you know, this person was firing straight through this mesquite thicket that you mentioned, and another person said the shots were being fired at an upward angle over the top of one of the trees out there. There are empirical tests that can be done to see which scenario is more consistent with the physical evidence, correct?
You would have to do that empirical testing to see if the cartridge case distribution would be affected by that type of angle of the rifle.
So you could test that.
Yes.
And then you could come to some conclusions about which scenario is more likely based on the physical evidence, correct?
If there was significant variability in the pattern distribution.
And that wasn't done in this case, is that correct?
Not to my knowledge.
Okay. Nobody asked you to do a test, to try to test the theory that this was being fired in an upward direction, correct?
Correct.
Okay. In fact, you were just asked basically to test the theory that these shots were being fired from the general location of the patio to the location of the body. Is that correct?
Well, actually, didn't test that. Brunel did, but it was, his report was consistent with someone firing from the patio based on the data that I had.
What I mean is okay. Let me go back. You were asked whether or not the shots being fired from the patio were consistent with the evidence that you observed. Is that correct?
Yes.
And in your opinion, shots being fired from the patio are consistent with what you observed, correct?
Correct.
And if I asked you, is the evidence that you observed consistent with somebody standing on the patio and firing in a more upward direction? Is that consistent?
In terms of the wound and the decedent,
In terms of the shell casings?
I wouldn't be able to determine that. I mean, again, I would have to do empirical testing, but I don't know if the distribution of the cartridge case would be significantly changed or altered by shooting it in the air. I mean, they're still coming out to the right of the shooter, but there is a geometry difference.
And my question is it possible that that's a consistent scenario? Somebody's standing on the patio in that approximate radius of the shell casings, and they're aiming in a more upward direction. That's consistent.
That's consistent, true, yes.
Thank you. Let me ask you a little bit about some of the testing that you did or that you reviewed when you were coming to your conclusions. You mentioned something about the impact of these bullets downrange, and you said that they basically made clean holes or something like that, right?
During my testing, all the impacts were circular.
Okay. That means when there aren't any objects in the way, the bullet is not tumbling, it's not in yaw. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Are there weapons where when you fire them, even though there are no intervening obstacles, a bullet might still be in yaw or it might be tumbling?
Yes, I mentioned that during direct. If the barrel is damaged or the rifling is missing or the barrel is corroded or intentionally altered, you can see bullets that leave the muzzle in yaw, meaning they're not stable as they leave the muzzle. And that was one of the tests that I performed. I wanted to ensure that that rifle was shooting straight.
And so sometimes just the design of the rifle or the condition of the rifle itself can cause a bullet to be in yaw, correct?
Yes.
Okay. So just because you see a wound that indicates the bullet is in yaw, that doesn't necessarily mean any intervening object had anything to do with that, correct?
Correct.
Okay. You mentioned something about point of aim versus point of impact. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Well, as I mentioned, the sights on that rifle can be changed, adjusted, and depending on the distance you're at. So say if you have it set for 50 yards and you shoot a target at 300 yards, your point of aim is going to be different than where the bullet actually strikes. And it's also a common term when you're hunting rifles with scopes on them and you're sighting them in. That's what you're doing. You're altering the optics so your point of aim matches your point of impact, so you know what you're hitting when you shoot. So that's what I was testing there, is with the 300-yard sighting, where is it striking at 100 yards?
And where is it striking at 100 yards?
Well, these sights compensate for bullet drop, right? You shoot the bullet through the air, it's going to be affected by gravity and drop. So that's what that sight is for, is to compensate for that drop of bullet. So if your sight is set for 300 yards and you shoot at 100 yards, your bullet's going to be high because it's traveling up and then coming back down to meet your point of aim, point of impact. And that's what I saw when I did my testing, is shooting at a circle at 100 yards, the bullets were impacting high. And that's what I expected to see.
And so at that distance, what was the difference between point of aim and point of impact?
Well, it's going to be a little variable. It's my testing setup. It's not precision, but about a foot high on average is what I was seeing.
And so just so we know, that means if you're aiming with that weapon at an object at 100 yards away approximately, and you aim at something that's 2 feet off the ground, the bullet's going to land 3 feet off the ground. Is that approximately correct?
Assuming that you're aiming it properly, yeah. It's precise. And these rifles aren't precise. They're battle rifles. They're not sniper rifles. So there's variability shot to shot on where the bullet impacts, even in a rest.
But there's just going to be a difference between where you're aiming at versus where the shot lands.
Yes.
Okay. And at 115 yards, the difference for this rifle was about a foot, right?
About a foot. I didn't map it out, but again, this is just my main concern there was the bullet stable.
And were you aware of the height of the entrance wound on the victim that's found in his face?
I'd have to check the autopsy report, but the right flank would be several feet off the ground.
And just approximately, if I said it was about 4 feet off the ground, would that sound more or less correct?
Yes.
Okay. We're not doing a scientific test right now.
Okay.
Just approximately. So, and we have to start with some assumptions, right? Because we don't know where this person was or how this person was standing when they got shot. But let's assume that they're just standing upright, okay? And the shot comes in and it hits the person about 4 feet off the ground. That means that the point of aim was somewhere around 3 feet off the ground, correct?
Could be, yes.
At that distance, assuming that that distance is correct and the person is just standing.
And
right?
aiming it perfectly, et cetera.
Okay. And so somebody from 115 yards away, if they're aiming at a spot that's about 3 feet off the ground, they're aiming down. Is that fair to say?
Yes, if they're standing upright.
And that's another variable too. You don't know how tall the person who's shooting is,
Right,
correct?
if they're sitting or if they're prone or on a knee.
So somebody who's very tall, standing up at that distance is gonna be aiming in a general downward direction, correct?
It depends on how high the shoulder is off the ground, but yes.
Okay, well, I mean, if the person's 6'2" or so, and they're holding it at their shoulder, that's generally a downward aim, is that correct?
Right, you can anticipate the shoulder being 5 feet off the ground, and if the bullet's impacting 4 feet off the ground, then you would have to aim downward.
Okay. Did you account for any of that when you look through the Leica scan and the state's generally asking, is this possible? Is it possible that this shot came from this location and hit this person at this distance? Did you account for any of those variables?
Well, I certainly account for them, and that's why my conclusions are consistent with and not inconsistent with the shot coming from that area, because I don't know the body's position, I don't know the shooter's position, because I don't have any fixed points for which to measure.
Okay, and so did you test different scenarios involving shooters of different heights, for example?
No.
And were you provided any information about how tall the shooter was in this case?
I might have, but I didn't consider it for what I was doing.
Okay, but you agree you need that information to determine the possibility of this shot coming from this location and hitting this person, correct?
I don't necessarily need the dimensions of the shooter, just because there's so many different shooting positions, and also I didn't have a known position of the decedent either. So even if I would have considered that, I mean, all factors given, it's still consistent that the shot could have come from that area.
Well, I guess how do you know that that's even possible if you don't have these variables to consider?
Well, I know that the bullet can travel 115 yards and penetrate a body. And if we don't know the position of either the victim or the shooter, I go back to what I know about that particular weapon platform and what it's capable of doing.
But there are other variables that you have to consider, correct? For example, if there was like a 10-foot tall, really thick brick wall in between where the shooter was and where the victim was, you would say that's not consistent with what you're viewing on the ground. Is that right?
Sure. Yeah.
Maybe that was a poorly worded question, but you have to account for the fact that if there are intervening objects, it could be possible that those objects actually prevent a bullet from traveling that distance and getting to that person, correct?
Yes.
And the position of the person has a lot to do with that also, correct?
Position of both parties has a lot to do with how that bullet gets to where it's going.
And you don't know the position of either of the two parties, correct?
That's correct.
And you also weren't provided any information about any other potential shooters in the area, correct?
No, there was no other ballistic evidence that suggested another firearm. I think I might have had some corroded pistol cartridges, but they were too old to have been involved.
And when you say ballistic evidence, you're only talking about firearms, ammunition, shell casings, physical things, is that
And
right?
bullet defects on objects would be the
Okay.
last component of that.
You're not talking about witness statements, correct?
Correct.
So if there's a witness statement who says, I heard a shot and it came from somewhere over there, that's not evidence that you're considering in making that determination, correct?
Primarily, my analysis is based on objective data that I collect.
Did you do a specific, let me pull this picture up real quick for you. This is Defense Exhibit KK. And it's already been admitted. Oh boy, okay. And can you see that picture in front of you?
Yes.
Okay, do you know what this is? Do you recognize this?
I believe this is the potential line of sight between the house and where the victim was recovered.
Correct. And so this photograph is taken essentially from, let's say, the view of the potential shooter, okay? And you can see it goes out there and you see all of those obstacles that are in the way, correct?
Yes.
And do you know what all of those obstacles are? Obviously, there are trees. Do you know what some of these other things are?
If I remember right, there was a storage box and some other random objects laying there.
And when you say storage box, are you talking about that big square thing that we see in
Yes,
the middle?
the big square thing.
Okay, I just want to make sure we're looking at the right object. Do you know how high that object is?
I would have to go back and look at the scan data to measure it, but I don't off the top of my head, no.
Did the scan data measure this and measure the height of this object?
Scan data measures everything.
Okay, and so it'll measure the thickness of those pillars, I suppose, right?
Yeah, so what it does is it makes a point cloud and every point is a measurable data point. So anything that it sees, I can measure up to probably like 5 millimeter accuracy. So once that scan is done, you can go back to anything in the scene to measure it.
Okay, and I guess my question is, given these obstacles and given the known measurements that you have for these obstacles, given the fact that this weapon has to be aiming in a downward direction, assuming, and we're making assumptions, I understand that, assuming the shooter is a 6 foot and change tall person who's holding this rifle at his shoulder. Given the point of impact and the point of aim, he has to be aiming generally in a downward direction, correct?
Based on the sights that were set on the rifle when I examined it. Yes.
That's correct. And there's that big object right there in the way, right?
Not sure it's entirely in the way. I have to look at them. I mean, based on the perspective of this photo, it does definitely look like it's in the way, but when you look at the point cloud, it seems to be a little more line of sight available. It's hard to say, but it leaves there. But yes, it's definitely something to consider as objects in the way of the bullet path.
And so if I'm aiming in a downward direction and I hit that object's going to stop a bullet, right?
And it would leave evidence behind.
Right, and there wasn't any such evidence that you observed,
Not
correct?
that I saw in the documents.
And same thing with those walls, the pillars of the pergola right there, right? Those pillars, those will stop a bullet, right?
Should, yes.
And if they don't, they'll leave evidence, right?
Definitely leave evidence.
And obviously that big mesquite tree, the thick branches, the thick trunk, that'll either stop a bullet or leave evidence, right?
Yes.
And there wasn't any such evidence that you observed, right?
Not that was in the documents that I looked at.
Okay. Let's talk a little bit about this, the tree branch, because you were discussing the tree branch that was broken, correct?
Yes.
And in the point cloud, does it show the general relationship between that location of that tree branch and the location of the deceased person?
It does.
Okay. And is it fair to say that that tree branch is a little bit to the, is it south?
South.
A little bit to the south of the deceased person, and it's in between the person and the shell casings back of the house, correct?
It is.
And so just describe to me, so if you think that the tree branch can cause yaw on the bullet, that was your testimony, correct?
Yes.
And a bullet like the one that you're describing is a bullet that can go through that tree branch, correct?
You can.
How much deflection is possible with this type of bullet if it impacts this tree branch?
I didn't do any empirical testing on how much deflection, but based on other testing I've done, you can think of a tree branch as being round, right? So if it hits it straight on or perpendicular to it, it's going to affect it less. If it hits it at a glance, and I've seen that in windows. I've actually bounced bullets off of windows and not broken them because they've hit so lightly, but still enough of an impact to stabilize the bullet. So it would depend, is the short answer, on where it hits on the branch, how much deflection and yaw you would get.
this branch was impacted at about 2 feet off the ground. Is that about right?
Well, assuming it was impacted, yes.
Okay, yeah, assuming that, and we don't know that. But I'm assuming that it was a bullet that strikes this branch. That's happening at about 2 feet off the ground, more or less, right?
More or less.
And it's a little bit closer to the house, so that might affect the point of aim difference. But 2 feet off the ground, you're going to have to be aiming at a spot lower than 2 feet off the ground with this rifle at that distance, correct?
It would depend on the distance to the branch. I mean, the impact testing I was doing was at 100 yards. So this is closer than that. So, and there's an arc trajectory on the bullet. So I would have to do some tests at that distance to see where you would have to aim, because it's coming out and going up and doing bullet things. But yes, there would be some kind of point of aim, point of impact difference.
Okay, and you don't know what that is?
Correct.
And so you don't know if that means that impacting at that tree from the distance is an aim that's higher than that tree or lower than that tree?
Right.
Okay, so we have no idea how the weapon is aimed if there's a bullet that hits that tree.
Yeah,
correct?
if it's a confirmed bullet defect.
Okay, and it's not a confirmed bullet defect, just to be clear, right?
It is not.
Okay, and do you know what sort of angle this bullet, let's say a bullet does hit that tree branch and it's gonna go up north where the deceased person is, right? It impacts at about 2 feet off the ground, this tree branch, but then it has to enter at about 4 feet off the ground. So do you know anything about the possibilities or probabilities of that happening?
I know it's possible because I've deflected bullets upward. And once a bullet's unstable, it can go any direction it wants. And going back to my glass example, I mean, I was shooting relatively flat, and that bullet deflected 30 degrees off the glass. And again, this is not apples to apples really compared to mesquite branches, but the short answer is I would have to do some empirical testing to see what directions the defect or the deflection would happen.
And I'm assuming that's probably impacted also by whether this bullet is already in yaw before it hits that branch, right?
Yes.
So if it's already in yaw, it hits something else and then it could be thrown even more off course. Is that right?
It could.
And the short answer is you don't know if this is really possible given the variables that we have on this scene because you haven't done empirical testing with these variables. Is that correct?
Correct.
Meaning mesquite wood is going to be different from another kind of wood and another kind of tree, right?
There's definitely varying differences in hardness of wood, and that dramatically affects bullet impacts and what happens after the impact.
And that's true even in the same species of tree, correct?
I would think so.
A tree that's maybe rotten or dying is going to be softer, let's say, than a tree that's, well, maybe it's not, I don't know, but that might make a difference, correct?
It could.
Okay. And there was some testing done of this tree branch to try to determine if it could be shown that a bullet actually impacted the tree branch. Is that right?
Yes.
And you didn't do that testing yourself, is that correct?
I did not.
But you reviewed the results of that, correct?
I did.
And specifically, the testing is looking for something that either contains lead residue or looks like a bullet hole. Is that correct?
Yes.
And in this case, there was nothing that appeared to be a bullet hole on this tree branch. Is that correct?
Yes.
And there was no lead residue collected from this tree branch either. Is that correct?
There's no lead detected on the tree branch.
So there's no indication that a bullet actually impacted this tree, correct?
Correct.
And were you also made aware that there was animal fur that was in or around this same area by this tree branch?
I think I'd heard that, but I don't think it's in the report that I reviewed.
Okay. If one of the detectives who first noticed the break in this branch says there's animal hair there, that's obviously another explanation as to how this branch got broken, correct?
It's possible, yes.
And there's no testing that was done on this branch to determine when the branch was broken either, right?
Not that I know of.
And I'm imagining that's a whole different area of expertise to determine the age of broken wood and things like that, right?
That is out of my realm.
Okay, mine too, if you can believe it. So there's no evidence to suggest that a bullet actually hit this tree and broke this branch. That's correct, right?
From the material reviewed, you're correct.
Okay. Did you test, when you test fired this rifle, did you, or when you reviewed Aaron Brunel's report on that, were you able to come to any conclusions about the grouping of the shots?
With the cartridge cases?
With the shots that you fired
So
downrange?
the impacts, no.
So you don't know if they generally land close together or if they're very spread out?
Well, with my testing, they were generally close together. I mean, they all hit a 3 foot by 4 foot panel at 100 yards. So, I mean, I know I was at least hitting that much area. Again, I wasn't going for accuracy, it was more stability and general impact of the sights versus the point of aim.
Okay, so all of the shots land, and you're firing in a stand, right?
Yes,
So the rifle is in a static position, it doesn't move, correct?
yes,
So every shot is fired from the same exact position of the rifle, correct?
in theory, yes.
In theory, when you're testing, and I know it's not perfect, but it's as close as you can get to holding the rifle in the same position and firing shots downrange.
It is.
And that gave you a result of a 3 or 4 foot, would you say, sort of area of impact for the shots?
Probably less than that, probably about a 2 foot. I mean, again, I didn't measure it. I was just trying to hit the paper and, you know, and that particular rest isn't as precision or as precise as I could probably get on how to hold that rifle. But again, I was looking for different things.
Could you just sort of show with your hands how big approximately that area is? Okay, so all of the shots you fired landed in an area that's that size.
Yeah, roughly.
How many shots did you fire? Do you remember?
To check my notes. $15 shots?
Okay, so all of those 15 shots landed in that area.
Yes.
In this case, you examined a body, right?
No.
Or you examined photographs of a body? Okay.
Yes.
That was not meant to be a trick, sorry. And you saw one entry wound in that body, is that correct?
That was my opinion. There was one entry, one exit.
There weren't any other bullet holes in that body, correct?
Correct.
And you didn't review witness statements, I know that, but there is a witness who states he was there just one step behind this person when this person gets shot. Assuming that the person who's firing the rifle, in this case, is firing at this person from 115 yards away, and assuming that person is holding the rifle steady and firing a bunch of shots in this direction, you would probably expect to see more bullet holes. Is that correct?
Not necessarily. I work a lot of officer-involved shootings of officers who are trained, very well trained to shoot, and they will empty 2 magazines and I can find 2 bullet defects in the area they were shooting. So it doesn't surprise me that there were a lot of shots and not a lot of bullet holes or defects.
Given the grouping of this rifle, and given, let's say that the person is holding this rifle fairly straight and firing shots very rapidly, and given the grouping that you tested, under those circumstances, you would expect to see additional bullet impacts, correct?
Now, going back to my previous example, I mean, officers, when they qualify, have to shoot their magazine in about an 8-inch circle to qualify. And I've seen, you know, again, lots of shots fired where the decedents hit one time. So, I mean, again, there's other factors to consider, but just the sheer accuracy of the firearm doesn't necessarily play into what I might see downrange.
How about things that are around this person when the person gets shot? If there are, let's say, 9 shots that are fired rapidly in this general direction, you're going to expect to see other things that are hit. Is that right?
Yes, there would probably be some defects in some of the trees out there, but what they would look like, I don't know. I know that some of the trees in Washington that I've shot and tested, very subtle. the impacts to them, and I only know to look for them because I put them there. So I could understand why an investigation might miss some defects that were out in that large area.
And if there are other animals in the area, for example, you might be concerned that the animal might get hit, right?
Well, yeah, any time a firearm is fired, you expect that, there's a level of danger to targets downrange.
And same thing with other people. If other people are standing near the target, right?
Yes.
You said, according to taking a look at the entrance wound, that it's your opinion that that wound was caused by a bullet in yaw. Is that different from a tumbling bullet?
No.
It's the same thing?
In terms of how it's going to affect a wound, it's the same thing.
Are there degrees of yaw or tumbling?
Definitely.
Can you tell anything, and just to kind of narrow that down a little, if a bullet is somersaulting over and over like this, that's pretty extreme, right?
Yes, and that's the word that you hear with a ricochet in the movies. That's what's causing that, is that bullet tumbling in over it.
But it could just be that the bullet's getting a little bit off course as it goes further, correct?
Certainly can, yes. And we have high-speed video evidence of both of those conditions.
And there's no way to tell from examining this wound what degree of interference this bullet had before impact. Is that right?
No, and that's something we could do with empirical testing. If a tumbling bullet would still penetrate, travel through the body and still exit versus one that was simply just slightly unstable, how much energy is it going to expel into the body and still have enough energy to exit the back skin or the chest skin in this case and go downrange? So again, that's something that can be deciphered, but in this case, there's no way to tell from the entrance and exit wound if it was a tumbling bullet or one in yaw, but again, for all intents and purposes, it's the same.
Okay, but the degree of energy that the bullet loses has an impact when it hits a target, for example, right?
Yes, and going back to that 800-yard case, that was one of the factors that I considered, was the bullet ricocheting off the water because there's a river there, and would it still have enough energy to go 800 yards and penetrate someone and kill them? And it didn't. So there is a level of instability that will affect the energy as it travels downrange.
Okay, and we don't know what object or what was acting on the bullet that impacted this person, is that correct?
Correct.
And that bullet was never found, obviously, right? As
My
far as we
knowledge.
know. Okay, and without finding that bullet, we can't tell which weapon was responsible for causing this wound, is that correct?
Right, if the bullet was recovered, microscopic comparisons to a particular firearm would be possible.
And that's not possible in this case, right?
Well, it's probably still out there somewhere, but not right now.
Okay. And having that bullet, we would be able to determine whether that matched the weapon that you tested, correct?
Yes.
And whether it didn't match the weapon that you tested also.
Yes.
So that weapon could be excluded or ruled out depending on the results of the testing of that bullet, correct?
It could be.
And you say the bullet's probably still out there. What do you mean by that?
Well, I mean, it wasn't recovered. And so we have a through and through wound on a decedent. So in theory, that bullet is, somewhere out there.
That bullet couldn't have been destroyed on impact later with the ground or anything like that? Tell me a little bit about that.
Well, AK-47 bullets, the 7.62x39, are steel jacketed with a copper coating. So you see a copper color on the bullets, but they're not copper bullets like you would see in a pistol. That is a copper coated steel jacket with a lead core. So pretty durable, pretty hardy, but also can be subjected to rust since they're steel. But you don't see any fragments really on the x-ray. So that bullet's really not coming apart. And so some of the things we look for on these type of injuries is there pieces of lead in the wound tract to tell you the bullet's coming apart or fragmenting. Didn't see any of that on the x-ray. So I would anticipate the bullet is fairly intact, whatever it is.
That's assuming that this wound was caused by an AK-47 full metal jacketed bullet, correct?
That's correct.
But it's also true this wound could have been caused by a number of different types of bullets, correct?
Yes.
What are some of the types of bullets that could have also caused this?
Well, it'd have to be a high energy, non-fragmenting bullet. And there's some other ones out there, but typically speaking, this is consistent with AK-47 round versus the type of energy, the lack of fragmentation that you see in this case.
What types of weapons are consistent with the type of weapon that can fire the rounds that you just described?
The AK-47, the SKS rifle, which also shoots 7.62 by 39. There's, like I said earlier, a lot of other manufacturers chamber that cartridge in their firearms.
And can you, I'm sorry, maybe I missed it. Did you say what other types of bullets could cause this wound?
Well, it would have to be probably full metal jacket ball ammo. If you had a hollow point or a soft point, you would see fragmentation in the wound tract. And so you would need to be a full metal jacketed high energy bullet.
How many types of full metal jacketed ball ammo ammunition exist?
Well, just about any type of military round would have a full metal jacket. It's a Geneva Convention requirement. So 308 Winchester, 7 Russian round, the Russian sniper round, it'll come to me in a second, 7.54. And so there's some other different rifle cartridges out there that do have full metal jackets.
You described the AK that you examined as a common type of rifle, right?
Yes, to my knowledge, it's the most common rifle in the world.
Okay, I just want to say what you meant by that, but you just answered that question. So that's the most common type of rifle in the world, the AK-47.
Common platform, yes. Most of the ones in the world are machine guns or full auto, and this is the civilian semi-automatic version of that.
Would that then make that ammunition the most common type in the world as well?
It could, yes.
And so just to cut to the chase, there's no way to tell whether this wound that you examined was caused by the rifle that you tested, correct?
That's correct.
That's not something that we can prove scientifically, correct?
At this time, correct.
Okay. And you mentioned that this must have been a longer distance shot with a rifle. Explain what you mean by longer distance shot.
Well, a close range shot would deposit gunshot residue from the gases onto the clothing and the wound, and those were tested and determined to be negative.
You said the clothing was tested, correct?
Yes.
Do you remember if any testing was done of a backpack?
I didn't see any of that in the documentation.
Okay. If a backpack were being worn by this person, that's close to the body, right? That's almost a form of clothing, correct?
Yes.
And that could be tested also to see if this shot possibly came from closer range, correct?
It could be, but typically that testing is done around the wound area. So, but yes, any object or clothing item that the person's wearing that's outer on the outside, we would probably look at.
And if the wound is sort of here on the lower flank or back area, that's going to be near the backpack, correct?
Like on this side.
Right. So a backpack is going to be near that wound.
Could be, yes.
And so in order to do a full empirical test to see whether this was close range or further away, it would probably be a good idea to test that backpack too, right?
Assuming they were wearing the backpack at the time, yes.
Assuming that, right. And to your knowledge, that wasn't done in this case, right?
I saw no reports relative to a backpack test.
When you say that was it gunshot residue that you're able to see to determine if this was a closer range shot? Am I understanding that correctly?
Yes.
Okay. If you see gunshot residue on a person, or if you don't, how far away is the closest that a shot can be fired without leaving gunshot residue?
It would depend on the firearm and ammunition type, and that's one of the common procedures that we do is distance determination, meaning how far is the rifle away from the target where all that residue is dispersed and not deposited on the clothing. So you would have to do, again, empirical testing to determine that. But typically speaking, several feet before you do not detect any of that residue.
So when you say a long-range shot from a rifle, what you generally mean is that shot came from several feet away or further.
And impacted some kind of intervening object along that path.
Could the clothing cause that yaw that you described? Just hitting the clothing?
Well, the clothing had the same type of defect.
What about the backpack?
Again, anything in that trajectory path could affect the bullet in its flight path.
And or it could have been fired from a weapon that shoots a bullet that has yaw, right?
Yes.
So there could be nothing in between the shooter and this person, right? But there can still be yaw, correct?
Yes.
Because the weapon being fired could be the kind of weapon that produces yaw, correct?
Yes.
And given that there's no gunshot residue, or no, whatever you call it, I'm sorry, but you could have somebody who's standing just several feet away firing a weapon and cause this wound that you're seeing, correct?
Right. A good rule of thumb is about 6 feet or so before you don't see it, but I've seen it. It's like everything else in forensics, there's always an exception. So you would need to do the testing with the known firearm to determine that.
So this wound could have been caused by somebody standing 6 feet away with no intervening objects, correct? Possible.
With a firearm producing yaw in the muzzle, yes.
That's possible. Do you know, you were talking about testing the clothing. Do you know how soon, or how soon that testing has to be done in order for that testing to be effective?
Well, we're looking for heavy metals, and so they persist. Looking for antimony, lead, strontium, barium.
So you can do that test pretty much,
Yeah,
how long?
those metals stay there, and they don't degrade, say, like DNA does. So you can do that testing. I'm not sure, there probably is a timeline, but I know it's a pretty long one to be able to still detect those metals.
And so the fact that that testing was done and there wasn't any gunshot residue discovered is a pretty strong indication that there wasn't any there, period, correct?
That's consistent, yes.
And the same is true for the tree branch, right?
Right, the lead would persist. In fact, I have a pole in Seattle that I test every couple of years, and it still reacts, and the shooting was in 2009.
So the fact that there's no lead residue in that tree branch is a pretty strong indication that there never was, right?
I didn't examine the tree branch, but just based on what I reviewed, that is true, yes.
In just a moment. Give us a moment here. Real quick follow-up. We talked about some assumptions that we're making and certain possibilities. And I just want to ask you straight up about certain things that you cannot prove in this case from the ballistic evidence that you reviewed. So number one, you can't prove who the shooter was, correct?
That's correct.
You can't prove which firearm caused this wound. Is that correct?
Caused the wound, correct.
You can't prove which type of ammunition caused this wound, correct?
That's true.
Can't prove which bullet caused this wound, correct?
Also true.
Can't prove which direction the shot came from, correct?
Correct.
And we can't prove how far away this shot came from, other than further than 6 feet away from this person, correct?
Yes, true.
That's all I have, Aaron.
Correct.
Yes, sir.
Hey, Rick. We'll leave off real quick. But we'll start off where you just left off. About proving. When we say the word prove, are we talking, you're referring to you forensic scientists, right?
Yes,
You live in a world of certainty, right?
I do.
Absolute certainty.
I try. I
Try.
strive for that.
So when you use the word prove, we're talking about, I mean, with absolute certainty, this is the weapon used to kill this victim, right?
Yes,
There's no way for us to have absolute certainty because we don't have the bullet, right?
that's correct.
But there's other evidence in this case, right? You've been in crime scenes before, right?
Investigated crime scenes.
Yeah. And there's other evidence that helps people out to determine what happened in that situation, right?
Yes.
Other than the weapon and other than the bullet, right?
Objection, leading.
Let me ask you. I'll show you Government Exhibit 121. Remember that photo I showed you earlier?
I do.
That's a picture of the property from an aerial view with the cones.
That's the top down of the porch area.
And you see some, in the yellow thing, you see some cactuses to the right.
Yellow circle
Yeah, like
Over
5 o'clock on the yellow circle.
over here.
Yeah, that one right there. You see cactus, right?
Yes,
Right. The shell casings are found in the yellow circle, right?
they are.
All right, I just want to make sure we all understand cactus. And let's just assume, if I can just get right behind the, I'm just right here, I'm sorry, just right here. If I can put my pin right there, let's just assume there's a potted cactus plant there, potted prickly pear. Assume that, okay? Would that interfere with, just with my line sight, shooting in a horizontal way outward? A potted prickly pear?
It would depend on how those cartridges hit, but I mean, there is a pretty decent pattern of all them landing in the same general area.
One, can I get exhibit 35? And you saw the body orientation in this case, right?
I did face down.
Face down, and you testified on cross. Did you see any bloodletting?
There wasn't any in the photographs of the scene that there was a blood trail, if you would. I mean, there's obviously bloodletting around the wounds, but I didn't see anything, and there was nothing in the notes that I saw that there was any observed.
Just for the jury's understanding, what was meant by bloodletting?
Bleeding, dripping, pouring, depending on the size of the wounds, and if the person's moving while they're a bloodletting event, will be patterns to interpret.
I'm going to show you exhibit 35A, already admitted into evidence. See, let me zoom out just a little bit.
Foundation.
There's been a lot of questions asked about bloodletting. There were no objections before. I'm gonna reverse myself. The question was just a yes or no. Did you see it or not in the photograph? He said no. The answer stands.
He testified on cross-examination that you don't use trajectory rods with bodies.
It's still used, but it's not the common practice for trajectory rods and bodies. My understanding is certainly in King County and Seattle area, that's not done.
So if there's no trajectory rods here, in your expert opinion, if there's no trajectory rods used by the Santa Cruz County Sheriff's Department, does that reflect upon their crime scene investigation?
Objection foundation as to whether that reflects upon a crime scene investigation.
Overruled. I don't expect to see for crime scene investigation, I don't expect to see trajectory rods and bodies, and I would not use it to form my opinion anyway because of all the variables that I'm aware of for using that practice.
There was talk about the entry wound and exit wound of the victim.
Yes.
I think we had like a visual, the entry wound in the right flank, you said?
Yes.
Right, and do you remember where the exit wound was located?
Chest?
Chest area?
Yes.
Right, so just explain to me as an expert, entry and exit, what direction is that bullet going?
Back to front?
Back to front? Any elevation?
I think it was slightly upward, but again, there's variability in how a person can move. So that doesn't necessarily mean the bullet was traveling upward.
Variability in how the person moves is one factor, right?
Yes.
The other factor, can the bullet continue to yaw in the body?
Yes.
Oh, I take it. Let me ask you, as I'm looking for I think it's actually KK, Defense Exhibit KK. Let me ask you about, this is common, do you wear a backpack? Ever wear a backpack?
I have worn a backpack.
Backpack goes on the back, right?
Does?
Backpack, will it cover the sides of a person, typically?
Typically, no. It depends how big the straps are.
And then when you're talking about the residue on clothing, you testified on crossover, the residue on clothing, right?
Yes.
And let's just use this example, when a bullet hits clothing, nothing interfering, I think your testimony was it's going to leave residue, right?
Well, a bullet leaves residue as well as the gases leaving with the barrel. So the bullet will actually have lead on it that it picks up in the barrel. And we call it bullet wipe. So when it strikes clothing, it will leave like a soot residue around the bullet hole. That's if there's no intervening object and other things, you will see that. I think all that was tested for, but you have to ask the other expert.
Do you have any, in your report, in your review, was there any evidence of any bullet wipe residue on the victim's clothing?
Not during my review.
You just have your KK. Let me show you this marked as Defense KK. This is page 2. Remember testifying about that image?
Yes.
You have no idea about where the photographer is standing or how high or how tall the photographer is taking that photo?
I don't.
I will show you another one. It's the same photograph the government has. It's on State or Defense Exhibit KK. Same location of the photograph. Look at the same direction. You see that one?
Yes.
This one's a little bit different, right?
It is.
In the background, you see that box right in the middle. See that box?
I do.
Right, and you testified earlier, there's no evidence of any strike marks on that box, right?
Not that I saw in the review of the crime scene documentation.
But right behind it, you see like a horizon landscape right there?
I do.
Do you know what the elevation level rise is from point of photography to that spot? Do you know what that
I
is?
believe there's a creek bed, so it's trending downward as it goes that direction, as it goes east, and the scan data supported that.
I'm talking about right at the right, you see right where, this spot right there. Is that higher or lower than the box?
What's higher than the box?
It's higher than the box. And do you know, if you know, do you know where the victim's body is found?
Roughly in that direction.
Let me ask you about left-handed or right-handed. Do you know of any evidence that you reviewed that indicate any preference for a right-handed shooter or a left-handed shooter at all?
In terms of the ejection pattern,
No, did you review anything, any document, any piece of evidence that suggested anything about a right-handed or left-handed shooter?
I can't recall. I thought I might have heard something about that, but it wasn't anything I considered.
Let's talk about the ejection pattern. You talked about, we did a little demo in the well. We talked about if I had a horizontal shot straight ahead, right? My ejection pattern is going off to my right-hand side, right?
Yes.
Right. If I angle my gun up a little bit, the barrel changes, but my, what do you guys call that? The ejection port? Ejection port. I mean, it's still in the same general area, so would that significantly change my ejection pattern?
Well, I would need to do testing, but I would not anticipate it would significantly change. But again, as I testified on cross, there is a geometry change in that relative positioning, but is it going to be significant? I don't know.
I'm going to show you Government Exhibit 121. So when we talk about change, significant change or not, if I'm standing where the cones are at, horizontal forward, yellow is where the ejection pattern is at. If I were to rotate my gun up a little bit at a 35-degree angle, whatever, am I going to get considerable change? I'll have some geometry change, I got that. But I'm going to have significant, will it be significant change?
I don't think so. I've done similar testing with pistols, with different orientations, and I've not seen a significant change in where they ultimately land versus where the shooter is standing. I mean, there's some change, but not significant. But again, significant be up for argument.
I'm going to talk about that in a second, but we're not talking about the pistol where you go upright and then go gangster style. We're not talking about that with a rifle, are we?
Right.
All right. Let's talk about significance. We're not, if my angle is 35 degrees, we're not talking about a shooter standing over here, are we?
I don't think so.
We're not talking about a shooter standing all the way out here, are we?
Again, I don't think so. I'd have to do empirical testing, but my experience, I would not anticipate that.
And you know that, about the tree. What's your opinion about this tree branch in this case?
But in terms of what?
About, is this tree branch the cause of the yaw, in your opinion?
There's no evidence that the tree branch was impacted by a bullet.
Do you know why the sheriff's department collected the tree branch?
I think it was photographed. That's probably my suggestion. I saw it in the photographs and it's like, well, that might be a bullet defect. I knew there was an potentially unstable bullet in play here. And I was looking for intermediate objects, and that was one photo of something that could have been an intermediate object. So it was collected and tested.
And that, do you remember when that was, when you requested the Santa Cruz County Sheriff's Department to collect that?
Not off the top of my head, probably slightly before they did the recovery. I can check my.
Can you just check?
Yeah, right for me. I actually don't have it in my file when they collected it. I think it was summer of 2023. Right after, I think I visited and did the test fire.
The summer of 2023.
Yes.
The incident happened January 30th of 2023. So months later, right?
Yes.
You saw in a photograph a broken tree branch,
Yes.
and you requested recovery of that tree branch.
I did.
Let's talk about, can we talk about clustering? We talked about that rifle being in a set position shooting, right?
Yes,
And even in a set position shooting, it still had some variation when it hit the target 115 yards away.
with the bullet impact or the cartridges?
Bullet impact, that's right, thank you, bullet impact.
Yeah, the bullet impact there is some variation with that particular style. And again, it wasn't the preferred method of stand that I would normally use. So there was a little bit of variability there, but I got as best I could with accuracy.
And that stands kind of like I always think like a vice grip, grips that gun in place,
Right,
doesn't gyrate, move.
correct.
And guns like that, they have a kick, right? They have a recoil, right?
There's a recoil.
Right, and human factors play, and you shoot guns, right?
I do.
There's always a recoil factor with a shooter, right?
There is.
And it changes based on strength of the individual,
It could,
the age of the individual,
possibly.
if an individual's healthy or sick, right?
There's lots of factors that can vary how that firearm is held shot to shot.
And the biggest factor is whether or not they're a good aim or not, right? Does a shooter's precision ability impact clustering?
How good a shot there, you mean?
Yeah, how good a
It
shot?
can.
You testified that you've seen officers who qualify. When I say qualify, you know what I'm referring to?
I do.
Explain to the jury what qualification means for a law enforcement officer.
Depends on the agency, but usually at least once a year, they have to fire their duty weapon on a course and shoot it at different distances and have a certain degree of accuracy to be able to carry their firearm.
And so they have to hit a target and cluster that target, right?
Yes,
And to be a law enforcement officer, you gotta be pretty good, right? To qualify.
yes,
And you testified on cross that even with that kind of skill set, they still miss their target even at close ranges.
absolutely.
Just one more second, Your Honor. Let me check with counsel real quick. You testified that no bullet, no projectile was found, right?
That I know of.
And do you know what efforts the Santa Cruz County Sheriff's Department went to try to locate the projectile, the bullet?
No.
Let me ask your opinion, and your expert opinion. Is the AK, let me talk about the wolf, is the wolf bullet the most consistent round to cause the injury to the victim in this case?
Most consistent? It's definitely consistent with everything I know about that ammunition type and that weapon platform.
And how about the use of the AK to cause that injury?
Not sure what you mean by the use of an AK.
Pretty consistent. We've got an injury, the distance, right? We have the severity of the injury. An AK can or cannot cause that injury.
It can.
I have just one more photo. You know what exhibit number that is? You gave me the photo.
34.
Just 1 second, Your Honor.
And I have the picture.
Okay. I'm going to show you, is it either A through M? It's one of A through M. I'm going to show you, can you put up something I'll identify? Put it up. Is it- Yeah. is one of the pictures in 35, State Exhibit 35. Do you see where the victim's body is located, Rick?
I do.
You put a little circle around the victim's body. Have you seen this photo before?
I think so, yes.
Yeah, and what's in the background? Can you tell?
Mesquite tree.
And further behind that?
Appears to be lights.
Do you know what's behind? Do you know where the lights are coming from?
Based on, I think the orientation, that's the house.
That's the house. No more questions, Your Honor.
Thank you, Mr. Jetty. Ladies and gentlemen, jury, any questions from the jurors? Okay. Question from the juror is, in your opinion, what direction would the victim fall if shot in relation to where you believe shots were fired from? Face up, face down, or face up? Okay. If you know.
It's a good question. It's really hard to evaluate that. I've seen many videos of firearms incidents and people fall in a variety of ways. They usually fall in the direction, the momentum that they're traveling in because they're focused on other things. But even if they're twisting at the time, they could spin all the way around because they already started that twisting motion. Not that the bullet's twisting them around, it's just that they've started that action. And also there's some nervous reactions that happen, like involuntary jumps and things that occur. So it's really hard to evaluate or predict where someone would fall after being struck, even with a high energy bullet.
I think so. I'll give this question to the jurors. Counsel, let's get back on headset. Thank you, sir. I appreciate you making the journey. Of course. All right. I told you earlier that the lawyers did some work on their own last night, came in this morning and told us about these stipulations that they had agreed to. And that made it possible for us to get this witness in and complete his testimony and let him go back to where he came from. Talked to the lawyers. They tell me that the trial and the pace of the trial is going
just consistent with what they anticipated. So we're on track. We're not running behind or ahead of time. So given that, unless any of you have any objections, we're going to recess for the day and start back Tuesday morning at 8:30. No objection? This is your chance to make an objection. All right. Before you go, please remember the admonition of the court. It's again a long weekend, 3-day weekend. Do not discuss this case with anyone. Do not have any contact with the lawyers, defendants, witnesses, victims, or victims' representatives. Do not conduct any independent investigations. Do not use any form of communication, post blog, or post anything on the internet during the trial. Do everything you can to avoid media coverage. And with that, have a good weekend. We will see you Tuesday morning, next Tuesday morning at 8:30, and we'll begin the trial again, but Tuesday through Friday next week. All right, thank you.
We tried it before.
Okay, so the trial of George Kelly has recessed for this Friday afternoon. The court let the jurors know that they will remain in recess until Tuesday when the trial will resume, and the case of George Kelly. Now, today we had the expert witness for the prosecution, basically to say that the firearm that they recovered from Mr. Kelly functioned properly. That's one of the things they have to prove as an element of the offense. And then also, I thought it was pretty good cross-examination. Basically, it's like, you can't really say the angle was how the gun was fired, that it was, that it actually hit us, anything other than this tree that the prosecution keeps talking about. You can't admit that he did that. And basically it came away as like, well, yeah, I can tell. I think it's consistent with a 7.62 round, which would be consistent with the rifle that Mr. Kelly fired. But that's about it. But, a lot of this is dog and pony show type of stuff to show that the prosecution's done their work to figure out the angles, and that, it's going to that reasonableness like we talked about on the jury instruction there in in Arizona. It is the definition 13404 there in Arizona. A person is justified in threatening or using physical force against another when and to the extent a reasonable person would believe that physical force is immediately necessary to protect himself against the other's use or attempted use of unlawful physical force. So that is the big issue for Mr. Kelly's case. This is not a slam dunk for Mr. Kelly. The jury could reasonably say, hey, totally reasonable. Totally reasonable. I would have done the exact same thing. And that's really what you have to say when you use that reasonable man standard, is that I would have done the exact same thing. Everybody, the reasonable man, would have done the exact same thing. But when you start talking about shooting guns at distances is over, 2 football fields, that really gets into the question of, is that really reasonable? Was that immediate threat of force? I don't know. I get it. I see where Mr. Kelly's coming from. He's tired of people coming on his property. He was scared. He was in fear. That's going to be his testimony, I'm sure, for self-defense. And he's going to say that he acted like a reasonable man would have. And he thought that he used physical force that was necessary to protect him and his family. So we'll see. Like I said, the question is it reasonable? And remember, ladies and gentlemen, jurors, everybody thinks you're going to go, a lot of defendants go in, the jury's going to believe me. Well, no, a jury takes their job very seriously, and they're going to follow the law. And one of the things when you get on a jury is that you have to be able to say, I am willing to follow the law, even if I disagree with it, even if I don't understand it. I got to follow the law as a juror. And yes, there is a thing called jury nullification. That's where the jury says, yep, prosecution definitely proved their case, but we're still saying not guilty. Okay. That doesn't happen very often. It really doesn't. This particular case, obviously, you have a, there's somebody that's dead, right? General rule, when somebody's dead, somebody's got to go to prison. That's generally the way the prosecution and the government look at it. Mr. Kelly was offered a plea deal to some sort of, negligent homicide type of things, but he turned it down. And now he's looking at, what reasonably could be spending the rest of his life in prison, given his age. It's always scary. And I get it. Sometimes you got to do it. He's, Mr. Kelly's attorneys seem to be doing a fine job. Prosecutors are presenting their case very methodically. They're good, a little slow in a couple of spots, but they're making their points. So, like I said, the trial will resume on Tuesday. I will try to be here to observe it as well. The court took a break. I'm going to take a break. We'll see. I think we still have, is it the other trial still going there, Frank?
Yep.
Maybe I'll come back this afternoon and we can watch that one as well, but we'll take a quick break. So thanks for joining us, and thanks for watching the Crime Talk Network. Thank you.